Never has there been such a city with such a population of the damned. We would never tolerate such an abomination in the old world, but here the reach of the Camarilla is weak. They are, all of them, anarchs, even those who would call themselves elders. Many times have we attempted to put down the youth of this city, but again and again they return and bring new kindred into the world. For us to ever control this city, we must destroy them, and begin again with the children of our own brood. Heed my warning well. We must do it soon, lest the masquerade be truly sundered by these detestable fledglings. Petrodon, Justicar Nosferatu. Chicago by Night is another first for VtM during this early period, the first city book establishing the now well-known by night name scheme that would go on to be used by numerous books and become a common moniker for games around the world. It also served to establish many norms by which people would model their own games or cities, especially where the Camarilla is concerned, despite only being one example of many. In addition, the book proved to be popular enough that it saw direct updates in both the 2nd and 5th editions of the game. This book also continues the precedent set by the core book by way of containing more quotes than I can reasonably include in this video. I'll take a sampling of them like usual, but know that what you see here, much as with the video for the core book, is probably less than half of what was present. In addition, it should be noted that this book leans heavily into the idea that vampires are predominantly responsible for numerous events in the city's history, without regards for tact or taste. I normally use the content warning section in the video description to note this kind of thing, but in this case, it's a lot. Everything from the slaughter of indigenous peoples during the colonial days prior to the city's founding, and the destruction of the economy in the city of Gary, to the protests and riots of the 1960s and even the death of Mayor Harold Washington in the late 1980s. It's not the worst thing we'll encounter over VtM's history, but it is enough that I found it both fascinating and occasionally distasteful in turn, and felt the need to comment directly. There is also some inconsistencies in the book compared to previous and later books, such as the misspelling of diablerie with a Y at the end instead of an IE throughout this book alone, and a habit of mentioning characters that aren't explained or fleshed out later in the book. Chicago by Night isn't a particularly difficult book to find, but it is one of the larger non-core books, and does tend to go for a higher but not unrealistic price than you'll see many of the smaller books go for. The PDF is readily available on DriveThruRPG, and though it is not available for print on demand, it is part of a compiled book, Chicago Chronicles Volume 1, alongside the Succubus Club, which does have a POD option for those looking for the book at a better price point. The introduction begins by reminding us that this is the Chicago of the Gothic punk world, and though very similar is not the real Chicago you might know. It is a Chicago who has had its history influenced and often guided by the undead. The elders value mortal culture, and the city retains that much at least, but molded into their own image. The Toreador value the art museums, the Ventrue favor sophisticated clubs and high-end restaurants, and the Malkavian seek solace in the intellectual coffee houses of the city. But for all of its enlightenment and culture, their presence also brings with it a darkness and evil that settles like a stain into the dark crevices of the city. For every theater or art gallery, there are 3 nightclubs catering to drug addicts and skinheads. For every classy restaurant, a seedy bar filled to bursting with the dregs of humanity spending their money to forget, for a time, the horrors that surround them. This suits them just fine. Chicago is a massive metropolis city located in the state of Illinois on the shore of Lake Michigan, and encompasses a large amount of land and has suburbs that extend into the neighboring states of Wisconsin and Indiana. Despite this, the book tries to focus on the core city itself, as outlying areas, such as Gary, are described elsewhere, and it is noted that Milwaukee will have its own book. It is stated again that this Chicago isn't quite the same as the one present in the real world. There are still cobbled streets, and streetcars still pervade the city instead of the more modern bus system, which was around even in the 90s when the book was written. Though not the largest city in the U.S., Chicago still has a very large population and is the beating heart of the U.S. Midwest, known by some as the nation's second city. Unlike other well-known cities such as New York and Los Angeles that have a clear vision they bring to mind, the book makes note that no two people are likely to describe Chicago the same way. The city is many things to many people, not least the Kindred themselves, and it attracts many of their number. The introduction also offers a number of resources for learning the kind of vibes the city can offer, split between books and movies. For books, this includes The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, to whom Chicago by Night is dedicated, Chicago by Studs Terkel, Chicago, City on the Make by Nelson Algren, and the poetry of Carl Sandburg. For movies, The Untouchables, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, The Blues Brothers, Risky Business, Flatlines, and Marked for Death. Before the next subsection, another in-world quote appears that seems likely to be in reference to the struggle between the White Queen and Black King described in Ashes to Ashes. Our champion has been unable to track down her prey, though she insists that she grows ever closer. The great conflict that she has fought for so many years is getting more and more out of control, and still the Brujah remains free. The only result of this conflict is that more and more anarchs are created, and that they are less and less under anyone's control. If she cannot succeed soon, we must at last reveal our hand, take the final solution, and enter in the city with our own hoplites. Just as we destroyed Carthage, so must we destroy Chicago. The cancer must not spread further. If it shall create war and bring on Gehenna, then I say, so be it. Better now when we are strong than later when we have been made weak. De Caligula, Letter to the Council. The book notes that the conclusion of Ashes to Ashes is left to the players and will have profound effects on things in the city. If Loden was not saved, then kindred such as Ballard and Capone, yes, Al Capone is a vampire, will vie for the position of prince, despite Ashes to Ashes noting that Ballard would take the spot, and the Primogen will be torn on who to support, creating rifts among them and setting off numerous conflicts as anarchs flock into the city from across the country and the Sabbat begin to take advantage of the turmoil. If Loden did survive, which is the default state of the book, then his generosity to those who saved him will have no bounds. Even offering to make anyone without anarch ties his bodyguards, it also notes he will name them archons, which per the core book is not how archons work, but I digress. Beyond that, his paranoia will increase dramatically. Blood hunts will be called for even the hint of an unsanctioned embrace. He will begin forcing blood bonds on those who reside in Chicago, and the city will become incredibly inhospitable to unfamiliar faces. Many kindred on the fence will be pushed towards the anarchs as prominent lines between them and the Camarilla are drawn and Loden's grip tightens on the city. The themes of this book and its city mirror much of what was seen in Ashes to Ashes. Deep webs of lies, control and mystery layered on top of one another, with each new discovery burying those who seek the truth even deeper into the mire. Or to put it simply, nothing is what it seems. The book also reminds the reader that this information can be used in any way that the storyteller pleases. Some or all of it can be excised, it can be transported to another city, any of the characters can be changed. Whatever fits your game is best. We are all introduced to yet another in-world quote, something that the book seems to be a great fan of. Let me give you a word of advice. If you obey his rules, he will leave you alone, even if you are a caitiff and have never been presented to him. The prince has enough to worry about without having to put down every anarch who is created without his permission. If you do not cause trouble by breaking the masquerade or actively plotting against him, he will ignore you. However, if you cross him, he will use every resource to crush you. Of course, the prince is often approached by those elders whom he owes favors and asked to inflict punishment for minor transgressions. If your enemies have his ear, then you are in trouble, no matter what you do. Rebecca, Monitor of Chicago. Chicago is home to more than 70 vampires of various origins and ethnicities. Many of Chicago's residents are descended from immigrants attracted to the city by industrial jobs, and most of the kindred and residents share some of this ancestry. The city is ostensibly controlled by Loden, and though most know of Loden and the Primogen Council, unbeknownst to most in the city is that the Primogen are much more than an advisory council, and indeed hold power over the prince. But the truth lies somewhere even beyond them. True control of the city is actually kept by two ancient Methuselah who reside in the city and have been at war with one another for a millennium. They have carved the city and its kindred into two opposing forces, but there are only 5 kindred in all of Chicago who know the true extent of these machinations, and of those there are only 2 who even know the names of their true masters. The conflicts that many see as arising between Loden and the Primogen, Loden and the Anarchs, or even Loden and Modius of Gary, are actually the machinations of these 2 ancient beings. Nearly all of the major functions of the city are controlled by the kindred. Everything from the government, politicians, to the police, the media, and even businesses and unions, and so on, are in some way controlled by them. To this end, some style of businesses that may have died out in our world could still be flourishing in the Gothic punk version. Vampires have a habit of treating businesses like they do vessels. Drain one too quickly, and it creates potential for discovery. Leeching life from it must happen over time. Slowly. Money is rarely an object to them, and their demands are many. A business that attracts their attention can flourish, but will ultimately be left worse than where it began when the creatures are finished with it. Paint peeling, floors dirty, and mortal customers long since moved on, with the proprietor left standing in the desiccated carcass of their once normal business, creating an aura of decay that extends far past the flesh and permeates the city, giving texture to the meaning of Gothic punk. Once more, we're greeted with the commentary from someone within this world. I tell you, friends, that this is a city like no other, a city with no restraint, a city ruled by the most irresponsible of councils. In the guise of maintaining the masquerade, they rule the teeming masses, but they mostly use their influence to combat one another. They do it almost openly, their contempt for the mortals, making them take the greatest risks with the greatest aplomb. For the neonate thrust into such an environment, nothing can be trusted. Nothing can be truly known. Nothing can be known as it truly is. The fledgling must be most careful, or else quickly become a pawn of some greater power. Soon the Camarilla will attempt to intervene, and when they fail, some of the greater powers will attempt the final solution. I beg you for permission to assist some of the higher-minded anarchs to help them create their own solution before one is imposed from above. I tell you, here I have found more talent and compassion than I have seen in many a year. Inyanga, Primogen. The book continues with some general facts about Chicago and its location, and then delves into travel into and around the city, in particular for the Kindred. Though travel is often an incredibly dangerous endeavor for them, they have a number of options available. Many of these services are often controlled by another kindred, and a favor with a prince or the elders of an area will generally be a prerequisite for using them. Road travel is likely the most dangerous, as any number of things can go wrong while in transit, but a newer method of utilizing a freight truck and being carried in a sealed container has begun to be used. Regular car travel is much more hazardous and requires meticulous planning and preparations of havens to use during the day along the way. Air travel is not very viable on commercial flights, though in the case of Chicago, Ballard controls an office out of O'Hare Airport, and anyone in Loden's favor is able to use it to secure a chartered or private flight. This, combined with a sealed container and the size and accessibility to the rest of the world that O'Hare serves, are both valuable tools, though many still mistrust this mode of travel. Chicago is also home to a large port with access to waterways that can reach the ocean and is a viable method for international travel, though much slower. The most popular method of travel for the Kindred is by train, as railway companies are predominantly controlled by the Kindred, and this method is safer than by road and much swifter than by boat, and provides a number of options for them, such as specially made private cars. Within the city, travel works much as it does for anyone. Many Kindred will have personal transportation, but public transportation and taxis are also available. It also talks about a robust train and subway system, in part thanks to the Ventrue known as Drummond. In addition, for more well-off Kindred, many of the towers and skyscrapers in the city have access to helipads, and such travel methods are an option. It should be noted that though the book previously referenced the city as still having streetcars instead of city buses, this section directly references the city bus system as a common way for anarchs to hunt for prey. They only dimly recalled the things they had lost and refused to believe that there had been a time when they were pure and happy. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Dram of a Ridiculous Man. The Kindred have been meddling in the affairs of the city since before it was even established. Originally nothing more than a much-contested base, it had been abandoned during the War of 1812 after regular incursions from Native Americans determined to reclaim the land that was unjustly taken from them. However, in 1816, after the war, settlers returned in large numbers intent on building a city on the strategically important land. Despite the larger numbers, Chief Blackhawk felt he had a sure path to success in Pale Wolf, a white man who had been living among them since before his grandfather's time. This was none other than an ancient kindred known previously as Menelaus, now going by simply Menele, and the true identity of the Methuselah we had previously only known as the Black King. Sure that they would achieve victory, the Native Americans attacked the settlers. However, the settlers also had a kindred in their midst. Another ancient being who had dominated the commander of the fort's troops, known as Helena. this being the White Queen spoken of in Ashes to Ashes. She had tracked her ancient enemy, Menelaus, across the Americas, facing him again here, ensuring a fresh supply of troops and weapons to ensure her victory, and having lived among the tribes for so long, Menelaus was unaccustomed to the power of firearms. As the brave warriors who fought for him fell, he fell into a frenzy and rushed the battle lines intent on decimating their foes, and ran headlong into Helena, and the two engaged in direct combat. Their battle was so intense, and the level of blood in use so high, that it was said that the air around them turned red with it. They fought with such speed and ferocity that the battle could not be followed, but eventually things came to a climax as Helena dug her claws into Menelaus' ribs. Screaming with enough force to reportedly shake the earth, he headbutted her with as much force as he could muster, and they were both flung to the ground. The native warriors made a last charge to rescue their ancient ally, but before reaching him, Helena's lover, Prius, drove a burning stake into his neck before retreating to the fort with Helena's body. Though they lost many in the rush, they were able to secure Menelaus' body and retreat into the forest with him. With this, two of the most powerful kindred in the New World fell into torpor, watched over by their mortal allies. Despite this, their feud would continue through the decades as they called to their allies in their sleep, bringing many more to the area. Initially, Helena had an advantage, but securing her fort ignored the city that grew up around it, which allowed Menelaus to install his followers into the foundations, and the first prince of the city, a Brujah named Maxwell, belonged to him. Excluded from much of society due to his race, Maxwell was initially a fur trader in the city. Among the kindred, he found acceptance, and his placement as prince even attracted others to the city, including the now primogen Inyanga, who became interested in the city after hearing it had a black prince. The city saw rapid growth during the time of the Civil War, but without a notable increase in kindred. After the war ended, this quickly changed as Cainites began to pour into the city despite Maxwell's best efforts to keep the city as a Brujah stronghold. Among them was the Ventrue Loden. It wasn't until 1871 that he and his allies were able to stem the tide, and by then it was too late. Soon after came the event referred to as the Devil's Night. A Malkavian with a death wish lit a fire that rapidly swept through the city, destroying everything in its wake. Though surprisingly few mortals died, the blaze burned down over 18,000 buildings and a large number of kindred with it. In particular, it almost completely decimated the supporters of Prince Maxwell. In the disorder that followed, Loden saw his chance. On a night when Inyanga, one of Maxwell's few remaining allies, was out of town, Loden moved on the prince with a number of Ventrue and Toreador supporters at his back. Expecting the assault to be swift, they converged on the prince's mansion, but quickly found that they had underestimated the Brujah's strength. Maxwell quickly decapitated a number of his opponents with a saber before a Toreador managed to tear his arm off. Even then, they were unable to take him down, and he escaped through a window, never to be seen again. With this, Loden quickly ended the few remaining Ventrue that had survived the assault to prevent further competition and to ensure all Ventrue in the city would be of his line. Though the fires were a dire event for the kindred, it turned out to ultimately be a boon for the city itself, and it was able to exceed its former glory through its reconstruction, and Loden helped steer it towards becoming an industrial powerhouse of the U.S. However, the rapid growth was not without turmoil. Loden ruled the city through wealth and force, empowering his mortal allies and causing unrest among the working class and those upon whom Loden's favor did not shine. It was during this time that the Toreador Modius appeared seemingly out of nowhere, gathering the support of the disenfranchised workers, as well as the backing of multiple elders in the city, including Inyanga, who had disapproved of Loden's violent tactics in taking the city. At first, their confrontations were few, and most clashes took place between the police forces and city and business elite controlled by Loden and the working-class populace controlled by Modius. But the latter quickly began to overwhelm the former with violent tactics and strikes. As the institutions he had established began to crumble, Loden quickly realized he had few vampiric allies. In an attempt to reduce the sway of Modius's unions, Loden enacted a plan that resulted in one of his agents throwing a bomb amidst the police during a confrontation, resulting in a riot that saw numerous union leaders and police dead. 4 union leaders were hung despite courts not being able to tie the bombing to them. Ultimately, the act backfired on Loden, and the dead men became martyrs, galvanizing the movement. The situation worsened further during the Pullman strike of 1894. One of Loden's lieutenants, Drummond, who had stakes in the railways, had a hand in the use of federal troops against strikers that turned public tide even further in favor of the unions. The strike and its fallout quickly gained international attention and became an embarrassment to the city. Determining that these methods were clearly not working, Loden changed tactics and embraced Tommy Hines, a socialist and leader of one of the unions. Dominating his new progeny, Loden had the man begin to subvert the leaders of the other unions, promising them wealth and power to pacify the workers under them. Those that fell in line quickly saw improvement to wages and working conditions for their people, and those that proved to be more hesitant began to see attempted takeovers by organized crime. Modius's forces were slow to adapt to this new angle, and when they did, it was with ever-increasing violence. Modius's followers grew impatient with the endless fighting between the two kindred and began to take matters into their own hands. Namely, the anarch Balthazar and his sire, who decided to take the fight directly to Loden's helpers, regardless of if they were kindred or kine. With these violent attacks, Loden had exactly what he wanted. Going to the elders of the city, Loden warned of being overrun by anarchs and their incessant risk of masquerade violations, and promised he could restore peace. Weary of the long fighting, the elders reluctantly agreed. In addition, Hines got to Balthazar and managed to flip the Brujah for Loden's side, and these two events allowed Loden to begin a quiet, systematic dismantling of Modius's allies by a blood hunt under the pretense of masquerade violations, managing to destroy most of his opponents by the beginning of the First World War. Though he got most of the Toreador's allies, Modius was able to retreat to Gary and fortify his position there with the secret aid of Annabelle. The period after these events, known as the Cauchemar Praxis, were a relatively peaceful 50 years for the city, which Loden, of course, takes credit for, though most in the city see it a bit differently. Despite the relative peace, there were still some events of note. In particular, the eldest in the city found common ground. Though three of them, Inyanga, Khalid, and Prosit, had backed Modius during the Union conflicts, they found their power neutralized by the combined might of the Ventrue, Toreador, and Malkavians. Still not trusting Loden after he usurped Maxwell, and fearing for their own existence if his power continued unchecked, the eldest of the clans gathered and established the First Elysium of Chicago, modeling it after an ancient Toreador tradition of a place where no conflict amongst their kind was allowed. The place chosen was the Chicago Symphony Hall, and here the elders met, discussed, and came to an accord. With this, the Primogen Council of Chicago came to be. If their interests were aligned, it would be enough to counter Loden's power. Though Loden was aware of this meeting, he did not fully appreciate the effect it would have. This revelation occurred when he chose to embrace Al Capone in an attempt to take control of the city's organized crime. This ran counter to Prosit's desire to manipulate the underworld, putting the two kindred on a collision course. The council took action, and in a 5-2 vote, Loden was allowed to embrace Capone, but required to defer to Prosit when it came to matters of the criminal world. It should be noted that Prosit is never mentioned again directly, with it only being noted that the Brujah Tyler destroyed a child of Critias who refused to follow the rest of the Primogen at the end of the Council Wars in the 1980s. It is clarified in a later book that this was Prosit. Another side effect of the long period of peace was Loden focusing on his desire to utterly strip power from Modius, the Prince of Gary, whenever not dealing with other issues. Though the road was long, he managed to accomplish this with resounding success via destroying the power of the mortals under his control. Using his childer Ballard and Capone, they hit at every aspect that allowed the Indiana city to flourish. Ballard manipulated the steel industry at both the national and international levels, allowing foreign industries to flourish while curtailing local ones and driving the city's economy into a depression. Meanwhile, Capone used his criminal connections to run extortion, hijacking, and various other rackets to cripple the city. In addition, he managed to place some of his men into prominent positions in the unions to hurt them from within. All the while, the other Ventrue of Chicago used their influence to waylay advancement of the city's infrastructure, effectively stagnating it from multiple directions. By the time Modius noticed something was wrong, it was too late to break the stranglehold that had slowly crept around the city's throat. The period of relative peace was not unique to Chicago. Princes across the U.S. experienced a similar quiet period, but they grew complacent, and it was not to last. As the years went by, reports began to reach Loden of marauding Sabbat packs and a concern for increased anarch strength and numbers, with more and more neonates going unpresented. As the 1960s approached, unrest began in the South, where the mortal struggle for racial equality was picked up by black kindred. Too often the princes of these regions were the product of the racist cultures they ruled and responded with undue ferocity. However, the alignment of interests by both the Kindred and Kind proved too powerful as the civil rights movement began. As princes there and in other regions of the country began to crack down on the perceived threat, the anarchs that they had so long kept in check responded with unexpected ferocity and organized aggression, backed up by the discontented mortals. Nowhere was this felt more strongly than on the west coast, where younger princes often ruled, and the unchecked onslaught that happened saw many of these areas taken over by anarchs who still rule there to this day. In Chicago, the anarchs had been quelled years before during the socialist and union movements of the earlier decades, but by the 1960s they had rebuilt and surpassed the previous efforts of Modius in both strength and number. A shadow war began to take place as Loudon's concern over the anarchs grew. Throughout the early 60s, the Ventrue of the city spent much of their time trying to drive out the weaker Kindred, while the anarchs in turn tried to wrest control of mortal institutions out of the prince's grasp. Despite this, violence was predominantly avoided until one fateful night in 1966. On this night, Balthazar set out to find a Brujah who was rumored to have entered the city but did not introduce themselves to the prince. Though unable to find the individual, he did come across a group of Brujah gathered in a park. Fearing that they were there to conspire against the prince, he attacked alongside his Ventrue associates and slayed 2 of the Brujah. However, this group, a band known as Urban Sprawl, were popular figures in the anarch movement thanks to their music, and were one of the main reasons the city had not already erupted into violence, speaking regularly of non-violent solutions to Kindred coexistence. With these deaths, that peace was shattered, and the ferocity with which the anarchs responded shook the society of the Kindred in the city to its foundation. Battles broke out across rooftops and in the sewers, with no elders safe from their fury. Not in their havens, not even in Elysium. Over the course of the next weeks, more than a dozen Kindred on each side of the conflict met final death or fell to torpor, and though the violence eventually subsided, the war was no longer something waged in the shadows. With Chicago being the largest city in the U.S. under Camarilla control, it quickly became a focal point for the War of Ages. Anarchs flocked to the city, bolstering their numbers, and the Camarilla sent a group of archons to reassert the dominance of the sect there, and for the next 2 years they maneuvered against one another, trying to gain some advantage over the other. It was clear that a major showdown between the two sides would happen sooner or later, and as 1968 dawned, and pivotal events in mortal history came with it, that time arrived. A preview of the imminent violence came in April of that year with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., causing riots and before unseen bitterness from the mortals of the country, but for the Kindred, conflict did not truly come to a head until August of that year. At this time, mortals from all over the country and even the world, and many Kindred among them, poured into the city for the next Democratic National Convention, which would determine the party's nomination for the next presidential election. With recent events, the city quickly approached a boiling point, with the agitation of the mortals quickly filtering to the Kindred who fed from them. On August 28th, one of the last days of the convention, the tipping point finally came, though at first the fighting seemed little different from the previous skirmishes and ambushes of the last couple years. This all changed when Loudon, gaining permission from the Justicar Ventrue to end this anarch problem once and for all, acted. He sent the combined might of the police forces of the city under his sway, and the elders aligned with him against the anarchs and mortal protesters as they spilled out into the streets and violence erupted amidst protests, an event that was broadcast nationwide on live television. The overwhelming force of the armed groups of police crumpled the protester lines, and the anarchs were forced to flee. Once out of view of the cameras, the elders and archons came down upon them without mercy. All told, more than 100 vampires from all parts of the world disappeared that night, and though some may have escaped the slaughter, it is said that ashes covered the streets of the city the following morning. Though the prince's forces took losses as well, it was felt to be a resounding victory, and for the first time in centuries, the Camarilla felt that the anarchs may well and truly have been dealt with. Despite the risk to the masquerade taken, it was necessary to destroy more than a few pieces of footage and dispose of or influence certain witnesses. Stability was finally restored to Chicago. Not only had the city's anarchs been crippled, so too had the hearts of the movements in the dozens of other cities, and princes were once again free to brutally crack down on the younger kindred of their domains. Nowhere more so than Chicago. Loudon attempted to hunt down the few anarchs who remained in the city and put forth an edict that no embrace would be allowed within the city. The very few that managed to avoid these hunts went deep underground, and the anarchs played almost no role in events in the city for the next decade. Though they still existed, it was as part of the far-flung fringes of the city. In the early 70s, in a rare burst of activity, the Anarchs descended upon a group of criminals who had begun stealing animals from the Lincoln Park Zoo. Tracking them to their nearby hideout in the basement of an abandoned tenement, the Anarchs, led by the Gangrel Rosa Rose Hernandez, descended upon the thieves and killed them all. It was never known why the animals were being taken, though Rose claimed that they were going to be sold to medical corporations for animal testing, though this seemed suspect considering the array of animals taken. Though the deaths were written off as the thieves falling prey to their stolen goods, this did not hold any more credibility than Rose's theory for the theft's purpose, namely because the animals were also found dead, and had been drained of not only blood, but their bone marrow as well via punctures at all of their major joints. Loden found out about the occurrence and ordered Rose to appear and give a full accounting of events at Elysium, where she claimed the animals were found dead when the Anarchs arrived as the thieves were returning to their hideout. In addition, the place had been torn apart and all electronics were absent from the area. In the meantime, between this attack and the gathering at Elysium, a series of other attacks occurred under similar circumstances wherein human victims had their bone marrow drained. By Loden's order, these killings were quickly covered up by the city to avoid a panic, and the prince quickly instituted another purge of any Anarchs who had thought to begin living in the open again, with only Rose getting off with a stern reprimand despite her violation of the masquerade due to, quote, extenuating circumstances. The bone marrow-related killings ceased about a week after they had started, and the cause of them was never found. Gossip among the Kindred ranged from aliens to an ancient Methuselah with a strange new sort of hunger that had passed through the city. Despite the crackdown on their numbers and Loden's belief of a total victory, the Anarchs never truly stayed gone, and over time Loden began to relax his strict grip on the city. Eventually he began to allow Anarchs to openly reside in Chicago once more, requiring only that they obey his laws and present themselves to him at Elysium. Though most mistrusted him greatly, they eventually did so. Even with this new acceptance, it likely would have taken decades for the Anarchs to return to any numbers of note, if not for the appearance of a new leader, the Kindred known as Maldavis, to rally them once more. With the support of respected Anarchs and bearing mysterious power, she seemed to come out of nowhere and rose to power quickly. Gaining influence among the beaten rabble, she began to forge a new Anarch movement within the city. Ultimately, Maldavis may not have been enough to sway things if not for Loden's growing overconfidence and attempts to consolidate his power. In an effort to grow his control over emerging mortal institutions like the media and computer technology, as well as to curb the growing influence of his first brood of childhood, Loden decided to embrace a second brood. By the time he sired the fourth of these, the Primogen Council began to take notice, though only those who had opposed him in previous years were concerned by the development. Deciding to take matters into their own hands, they began to support Maldavis in her rise to power, teaching her the secrets of the city and offering their own potent blood to fuel her with still more strength. Though she never knew who her mentors were, she did have suspicions. Even with this backing, Maldavis remained only a minor irritation to the prince until 1983, when Loden managed to anger yet another of the Primogen, this time the Toreador Annabelle Triabel. Though not as powerful as the other council members, her vote was what split the Primogen Council and began the period known as the Council Wars. Maldavis began to move against Loden, looking first to his control over mortal institutions. Loden's control of whoever held the office of mayor in the city had never been contested and was always filled with mortals willing to do his bidding. It was here that she struck first, having prepared for years by presenting Harold Washington as a candidate for office. Though she did not control him directly, she was able to prevent Loden from gaining control of him as well. The move caught Loden completely off guard, and the Primogen Council blocked him from making a reprisal, preventing him from crushing the Anarch and having the mayoral candidate killed, and in April of 1983, Harold Washington took office. Despite the Primogen, Loden attempted to strike at Maldavis anyway, but found the Anarch forces ready for him, and even with the backing of the other Ventrue was unable to do anything meaningful. This set off a 4-year-long conflict between the two, though with little actual fighting as nobody wanted a repeat of the Night of Rage. Instead, they vied for control of mortal politics in the city, attempting to maneuver things in their favor, and as time went on, Maldavis's influence grew while Loden's began to shrink. Loden's complaints to the Camarilla fell on deaf ears as they too remembered the Night of Rage, and it was soon that Loden realized that some of the Primogen were not only working against him, but supporting Maldavis as well. As time went on, Loden's efforts grew more desperate and crude. One such attempt was known as Operation Incubator, in which Loden sought to ruin some of Maldavis's key mortal allies by sending the police to harass and publicly embarrass them. This move backfired when news of these actions reached the public, Loden's media censors not being able to catch it. Due to this failure, Loden embraced yet another neonate, Joseph Peterson, to gain stronger control over the media. In the spring of 1986, Maldavis's power reached its height, and the Anarchs began to strategically destroy key contacts and retainers within the mortal government and replace them with their own pawns. Desperate and terrified for his existence, Loden's pride finally broke sometime shortly before Thanksgiving of 1987, and he begged the Primogen Council for forgiveness and aid. After listening for hours to their complaints of how he ran the city, they ultimately came to an agreement. Annabelle agreed to switch sides under the condition that certain Ventrue were given free reign of the city, and that she would be allowed to sire 2 childer. He was also required to meet with the council at Elysium on the first Monday of every month to hear their complaints. With the council swayed back to his side, an Anarch spy was revealed to him, and Loden set about regaining his power, instigating what is now known as the Thanksgiving Massacre, beginning with a strike at the place where Maldavis struck him originally, the mayor. Loden drained the man to the point that he succumbed to a heart attack the next day. In addition, Loden was able to capture Maldavis's most trusted lieutenants, and that day sent mortal allies into the city to track down Anarchs and destroy them as they slept in their havens. That night became one of terror for her remaining allies as Loden's forces watched their havens and they had nowhere to turn. Once more the Anarchs had lost the bulk of their strength in a swift and brutal counterattack, but all the worse this time as even those who slept in their most safest and secret havens would often be woken in the middle of the day as a stake was driven into their heart. Even the most powerful Brujah elder, Prosit, disappeared during this period. Loden even nearly destroyed Maldavis herself, though she managed a narrow escape that Loden still does not understand, though he suspects someone among the Primogen may have been aiding her secretly. Ultimately, he contented himself with the knowledge that his power had been firmly restored and set about regaining control of the mortal institutions he had lost. Like most of the more intelligent kindred in the city, Loden suspects there may be a deeper game at play. Though some would see the signs of Gehenna in every happening, others suspect the jihad is played in Chicago. These latter have the truth of it, for Helena and Menelae yet remain in the city and despite their long torpor continue to manipulate the forces around them to continue their eternal struggle, and nearly all of the major events described have been at their behest in one way or another. Without even knowing it, Loden and the forces arrayed with him perform the biddings of Helena, while the maneuvering of the Anarchs comes at the behest of Menelae through his blood bond with Critias and the domination of key figures in the Anarch movement. However, the game is shifting once more. In late 1990, Helena woke from torpor and became active in the city once more. Her long sleep has left her disoriented and confused in a world she no longer recognizes, slowing her actions. She seeks to find Menelae's resting place, but fears protections that may be around him and his allies that may be able to cause her harm in her currently weakened state if she were to be discovered. She currently masquerades as a neonate residing in the succubus club known as Portia. Though seeming inactive, her struggle is not yet done. Seeing the power the Anarchs could wield during the Council Wars, she seeks to turn this particular piece in her favor and casts out for an Anarch pawn of her own, settling on the Brujah known as Juggler and Gary. She empowers him through her blood-bonded servant, Tyler, and is setting him up to be the next great Anarch power, and maneuvering conflict between him and the prince to give him credibility with the others. On Menelae's side of things, he too has slowed in his machinations as he tries to take a more subtle path, leading Helena to believe she controls the Toreador Annabelle, and also refraining from ending her plot with Juggler, hoping to convince her that she has truly won the Anarchs to her side without it being true. There is danger that she will actually succeed, but it's a risk he's willing to take. He worries that he played Maldavis too soon, before she had gained enough power, and now begins to doubt his own plots, worrying that another even older force may be controlling him as he controls his pawns. His moves now are made in an effort to ensure his will is his own. Helena believes that the Council War was her victory, having wrested control of Annabelle from him and toppled his mightiest pawn with the defeat of Maldavis, but this is what Menelae wants. Annabelle remains his to control, and he maneuvers new pawns into her camp, see Ashes to Ashes, so that when the time is right, he can end their struggle for good. After such knowledge, what is forgiveness? T.S. Eliot. There was a crack in his head, and a little bit of the dark world came through and pressed him to death. Rudyard Kipling, The Phantom Rickshaw. This chapter focuses predominantly, as titled, on the geography of Chicago. I will refrain from going into any detail here, as it's a lot of stuff about specific districts and the layout of the city, as you might expect from a chapter with such a title. Despite the fact that the city in which a game is set could be considered the most important character of all, the minutia is not going to serve any particular value for the purpose of the video. However, where there is additional lore relevant, I will include that. The book reminds us once again that though akin to our world, the Chicago of the Gothic punk world is different than our own, both in terms of architecture and the fact that the shadows that reside between buildings are somehow deeper, and at night few normal pedestrians are willing to brave the dark, with the lower class, the kindred, and the criminals reigning during these times. Despite this, the book is often very specific about the locations of a multitude of businesses and institutions, right down to providing the address. Though Chicago has many suburbs, called the Outlands, they are not featured here, as Kindred rarely visit these areas, with the exception of the occasional anarch gangs, or Gangrel, who will inhabit the parks. A vampire may stand out too much and more easily risk the masquerade in such areas. It is noted later, however, that many Kindred indeed keep their havens in the Outlands, but do refuse to feed or spend excess time there, moving into Chicago proper as the sun sets in order to preserve the masquerade and keep their havens safe. In Ashes to Ashes, we learned of Loden's haven near the top of the Sears Tower, but it was noted that he has many. Here we learn of others. His primary haven is on the 34th floor of the Prudential Building, in the area of the city known as the Loop, also called the Hive by the Kindred. He moved here in 1958 after previously residing in the Manhattan Building. He also keeps another in a condominium across the river. All have a layout nearly identical to the one described in Ashes to Ashes. We also learn a bit about the Kindred railway travel and its convenience for them, which is run by Edgar Drummond, and more for the site for Elysium, the civic theater in which resides the Civic Opera House, where it is rumored that an ancient Methuselah who inhabits the city sees nearly every performance, though none know the truth of these claims. It should be noted that in Ashes to Ashes it described the Field Museum as a place of Elysium, but Chicago by Night distinctly notes it as not part of Elysium, which in this title seems to be designated as distinct parts of the city and not just a single place, though Loden has banned feeding there. It also notes that Kindred rarely, if ever, visit the museum despite Ashes to Ashes stating the contrary. The district known as the North Side is where Daly's restaurant that serves as a lair of sorts to the Ventrue Ballard is located. It also notes an Italian restaurant known as Spiaggia, which has fallen out of favor. This is due to the fact that it is where Ballard went when he was first training himself to keep food down after becoming a Kindred. Insisting on sitting at the most conspicuous table in the restaurant, his habit of suddenly vomiting up food he ate began to drive patrons away, and even once he learned how to control himself, the amount and fashion in which he would consume food was enough to keep them away. The owner has been thoroughly dominated by Ballard and can do nothing but watch as his business falls to ruin, staying open only by virtue of Ballard's favor. Soldier Field is also mentioned briefly as a place Ballard will take young Kindred shortly before sunrise to flaunt his power over them, something we saw hands-on experience with in Ashes to Ashes. In the West Side District, the ancient Athenian Brujah Critias can often be found at the University of Illinois Chicago, as well as other colleges on occasion, where he will sometimes teach and learn more of the modern sciences. Every 30 years or so he will disappear for 10 years and return under a different identity to continue his pursuits, but rumors about him have spread among the student body, who often refer to him as the Doctor, named after the character from the British sci-fi show Doctor Who. This is also the location of a large medical district which is under some Kindred influence, and many retainers will be brought here if injured. The city's various airports are located in what is considered the Outlands, and are all controlled by the Brujah known as Tyler. As dangerous as flying can be for Kindred, those who need to do it can nullify much of the danger by going through her, but her services are not cheap. Gary is also referenced in this chapter, as though it's technically its own city, many consider it to be part of the Outlands, and it is located closer to Chicago proper than many of its own suburbs, and has more of a nightlife for the Kindred to take part in than other areas of the Outlands. Here we get a more direct description of what it means to be Elysium in the city, noting that this is generally where the elders prefer to go and will typically be places that are intellectually pleasing or have artistic value, such as museums, art galleries, theaters, and concert halls. The rules of Elysium set forth here are as follows. No violence to kindred, kind, or objects on threat of blood hunt. Elysium is neutral ground, and discussion should be limited in subject matter and politics avoided except when the Primogen meet. Access is not limited, and all kindred are welcome. Do not attract attention to oneself when entering or exiting Elysium. A child's sire will typically explain the rules of Elysium to them, and they are not inscribed anywhere and act more as general guidelines or etiquette. A special infraction and plea of ignorance may result in little more than a fine imposed by the prince or elders, but a large or willful violation will be met with little to no forgiveness, especially if a tradition or other edict was violated in the process. The rules of Elysium will typically be dictated to a kindred entering the city when presenting themselves as well, and for one who does not present themselves and breaches a rule, ignorance is not a valid excuse. Typically, the primogen will vote to decide on extending Elysium to a new building or area, then pass the decision on to Loden, who is responsible for informing the kindred of the city. An elder or the prince can also dictate an area as neutral ground or a place of non-violence without it technically being a part of Elysium, though adherence to the rules in such places has more to do with who the decision came from more than anything. Some of the most prominent locations of Chicago's Elysium are the Art Institute of Chicago, the Lyric Opera of Chicago, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and the University of Chicago. Much as we saw in Gary via Blood at Dawn, the area of Chicago known as the Rack is a hotbed of restaurants, bars, nightclubs, and other nighttime entertainment venues, as well as a place for lurking drug dealers, gangs, and prostitutes. Some cities have different names for such an area, including the Crucible, or simply the Hunting Grounds, and is a popular spot for kindred to hunt for blood or get embroiled in other mischief. In Chicago, some prominent locations include the Blue Velvet, as well as places familiar to us via Ashes to Ashes like the Cave and the Succubus Club. We learned much of the Cave in Ashes to Ashes, which is owned by the Malkavian Horace Turnbull. Both the Blue Velvet and Succubus Club are believed to be owned by kindred as well, though in their cases nobody seems to be able to verify that nor identify who the owner might be, but kindred are always welcome and let in without waiting in line in both establishments. In this section we also learn about the Blood Dolls. Unlike later editions, here they are described simply as a subculture of people who garner pleasure from drinking blood from one another, seemingly emulating the kindred despite not knowing of them, and who use the Succubus Club as a primary hangout. Despite this unique presentation, it is easy to see how they would eventually fall into being those who are addicted to and seek out the kiss of the vampire. The moon appears, reflecting on his heart, heavy-weighed and pierced. The walker looks at his days, bad deeds gone by, for which he must pay. Peter Murphy, Seven Veils. Chicago is noted as having one of the most severe overconcentrations of vampires in the world. Though most domains rarely hit the recommended concentration of one vampire per 100,000 people, the Windy City sometimes sees as many as 140 vampires in residence despite its population of 7 million. The prince has been either unwilling or unable to control this, though the strife in the city will see the number decline rapidly on occasion. Though some domains may scoff at Loden's inability to control the population, Chicago is an intersection at the heart of America and attracts kindred and kind from all over the world. In addition, the abnormally potent primogen and the war waged between the two sleeping Methuselah all converge to make a city that cannot truly be ruled. Loden merely rides the wave of events and tries to direct it as best as he can. Due to the recent battles of the 80s, Chicago is at one of its lower points in population at this time, around a more reasonable 70 kindred or so, though the exact number can never truly be known, due to the chaotic nature of the city. Due to the ban on embraces in the city, there are very few kindred contained here that have been embraced in the last 15 years. Unlike previous titles that were story-focused and listed only characters pertinent to the story being set up to play, Chicago by Night uses a full chapter to detail the various notable characters present in the city en masse and organizes them by clan, excepting where clan is unknown or they happen to not be a vampire, and also has charts showing lineages and organization charts and relationship maps for coteries and other groups. To be clear, this chapter takes up over 100 pages, more than half the book, so I will try to be as brief as possible on these characters while still capturing important lore details and being informative. Where it covers characters we've met in previous titles, I will only add new info. I also won't go into particulars of a character's stats or disciplines, as these are more gameplay mechanic oriented. But note that should you look into these characters yourself, there is a lot of strange or contradictory choices made with them that don't seem to follow the rules laid out in the core book all that well, and seem to have choices made in favor of form over substance. In addition, though I included it in the content warning in the description for the video, I feel the need to point out that there is a not insignificant number of kindred listed here who are embraced as children, so if that kind of thing crosses a line for you, use caution. There are enough of them that it starts to feel a little weird, honestly. It is said that the only thing Brujah have in common is their differences, and this is particularly true in Chicago. The younger members of the clan in the city want the rest to side with the anarchs and overthrow the prince. However, the eldest of the clan, Critias, Tyler, and Balthazar, all have their own plans, and such extreme action does not suit them. Despite fierce grudges amongst the clan, they will often set aside their feuds and come together during a moot to discuss and debate as a clan, though this usually results in one or two members being singled out and ridiculed. The choosing of scapegoats for their frustrations is one of the few things they can agree on. Menelaus. Once the king of a growing merchant city in ancient Greece, Menelaus, as he was once called, achieved a number of things in his mortal life, and though his city flourished, some came to covet what he had. A city in Asia Minor began to harass his merchants and ultimately kidnapped his wife. Menelaus gathered an army from allied Greek city-states and set out to do battle. Though the war lasted longer than he expected, they were ultimately successful thanks to superior numbers, but Menelaus was not able to enjoy the victory. On the night before he intended to enter the city in triumph, he received a visitor. Troil, a Brujah of the third generation, ruled over the city in secret, though he had been out traveling for some time. He returned to find his city fallen, and chose to seek out the invaders' leader and see what kind of mortal could have achieved this feat. Taken with the mortal king, Troil took him to his haven, north of the city, and there they spent months in discussion. Finding them worthy of immortality, Troil offered the embrace to Menelaus, who accepted. For the next few centuries, Menelaus traveled the length of Europe and Asia, becoming fascinated with the spirit plane and studied heavily in Persia and India before ultimately returning to Europe, intent on spreading what he had learned there. Upon his return, he met an ancient Iberian Brujah by the name of Altamira, who spoke to him of a grand city growing in North Africa that was set to rival the first and second cities, where their kind could live openly among the mortals in peace, progress, and equality that would last forever: the city of Carthage. Intrigued by the idea, Menelaus traveled there and found it to be everything he had hoped and dreamed of creating. Mortal and Cainite working side by side on art, science, and matters of spirit. The mortals willingly giving some of their blood to them, and they in turn helping to make the lives of the mortals easier. Killing immortals was strictly forbidden, and they fed together to help ensure the safety of all. He quickly settled in the city and joined together with others in the pursuit of Golconda. This was the beginning of the Third Age, and one of the only times in history up to this point that more than one vampire could exist together in a city. Prior to this time, settlements rarely had more than 10,000 people, and could not support more than one, but with the rise of cities such as Carthage and Rome, this was changing. Many Toreador supported the Brujah in their pursuits of Carthage, but other clans held suspicions of their motives there. In particular, Rome, which was controlled by an uneasy alliance of Ventrue and Malkavian, began to believe that the Brujah plotted to build strength in order to rise up and destroy the other clans, and soon launched an attack on the city. Menelaus, being an experienced diplomat and orator, became envoy for Carthage and set out to enlist the support of the Gangrel and Nosferatu. He also managed to recruit new Toreador to join them in the city, including the powerful and beautiful Helena. The war lasted for more than a century, and ultimately, after a years-long siege, Carthage was betrayed and fell to the Romans. The legions of Rome destroyed the city, burned its famed library, and salted the earth to prevent the rise of Kindred melted to the earth, a concept that doesn't seem to exist later in the game. Nearly all the Brujah were destroyed, with the few survivors nursing a deep and lasting hatred for the perpetrators of such an act. The betrayer was said to be a Toreador. The city fell while Menelaus was away in southern Africa attempting to recruit Gangrel there, and could not believe the ruins he returned to had once been a city. Fleeing into the wilds of Western Europe, he swore off cities and civilization forever, an oath he would break a mere 2 centuries later. Chancing upon a Gangrel in the wild, Menelaus learned of the city of Pompeii, said to be ruled by a stunning Toreador. He knew in his heart that this could only be Helena, and he traveled there in secret to see for himself, and found this feeling to be true. The sight of her ruling a Roman city, coupled with the bitter memories of Carthage in ruin, were too much for the Brujah, and he entered frenzy for the first time in a millennia. His rage, coupled with the power of a thaumaturgical ritual, brought a fire spirit down upon the city which seemed to tear open the sky, and rain fire down on the city as the earth shook with its might, destroying everything in sight. Surviving only by jumping into the harbor, Menelaus fled, but soon discovered that Helena had somehow survived as well, and they became locked in battle over the following centuries, with neither managing to gain the upper hand on the other. However, as Helena's ghoul Prius grew in power over the years, she began to take the upper hand, and Menelaus soon determined he must flee and gather strength, or would surely lose the fight. Faking his death, trusted retainers secreted him away on a specially made ship to the west, coming to the New World. Here, among the Incas, Menelay prepared once more, but after many years felt the drag of such anger on his soul and determined to be done with it. However, he soon learned of the arrival of the Europeans to the north, who quickly overcame the Mayans. Led by none other than Helena, her conquistadors quickly swept through the continent, and Menelay was forced to flee again. This back and forth continued for centuries until he ultimately came to a great lake to the north and settled among the natives there. Though he prepared them, Helena did not come, and he thought he may finally be free and began to pursue matters of the spirit and Golconda once more, though this was not to be. Helena eventually found him again, as described in Chicago's history, and their fateful battle that put them both in torpor took place. Critias. Critias is a 5th-generation Brujah who was embraced in the 4th century BC. In mortal life, Critias was a sophist in ancient Athens and garnered a substantial following in his time, teaching those who would go on to become great philosophers in their own right. However, when a plague wiped out half of the city's population, including its leader Pericles, the demagogues that took over sought out a scapegoat, and Critias became the first of their targets. Blaming him for the corruption of the city's youth, he was given the choice of death or banishment. Not willing to give up his life for his teachings, he packed his meager belongings, intending to head to Delphi. Before this could happen, Critias was approached by a stranger who enjoyed the mental stimulation provided by his teachings. This was none other than Menelaus, who believed that Critias might be a great addition to the Brujah clan. Using his dominate powers to keep the man calm, they spent the evening debating the nature of existence, death, and philosophy. Through this encounter, Critias was offered the embrace and accepted. With this, Critias went forth and proclaimed that he had come to realize the truths he taught were too important not to die for, and proceeded to fake his death and was buried. Rising from his grave the next night, Critias went to the homes of his tormentors and demanded to be let in, ridiculing them when they refused. Eventually he frenzied and broke into the home of one of the city's leaders and drained everyone in the house. After this, he fled the city and began traveling with Menelaus across Mediterranean North Africa, debating with some of the greatest minds of the time and feeding from them. During this time, he also fed regularly from Menelaus, not knowing of the blood bond. When they eventually separated, he had fed from his sire so many times and his blood was so potent that the bond was much stronger and longer lasting than is typical. By 3rd century BC, he came to the city of Carthage and threw himself into the utopian ideals of the kindred and kind living there. Thanks to his oratory skills, he was away from the city in Cathay when he learned of its destruction. Heartbroken and on the verge of frenzy, he traveled to Rome intending on retribution. Upon arrival, he claimed control of his anger and set his mind and rage towards bringing about its end. Though many of his attempts were thwarted by the intervention of the Malkavians or Ventrue, he eventually decided on a more direct route and found a kingdom in Asia Minor whose king he could control and direct against the empire. Upon attacking Rome's Asian legions, the bloodshed affected him so greatly he frenzied and for multiple nights tore the Romans apart, inciting his troops to take up his bloodlust and do the same. This lasted until he came to his senses after the killing of a child, at which point he melded with the earth and spent a long period there attempting to come to terms with the violence that overtook him. Eventually, he fled north and spent centuries among the nomads, feeding only on animals. In time, he came to terms with the deeds that he had wrought, and sought to re-enter civilization, and sought out Constantinople, where he hid his identity to avoid allies of Rome, and spent millennia among its academic circles. Ultimately, he chose to travel once more and seek out the blossoming centers of learning in Europe, even funding the expedition of a ship's captain who believed the world to be round. Unbeknownst to Critias, much of his movements and actions since the fall of Carthage has been directed by his bond to Menelaus, in particular the funding of the voyage that saw his sire to the shores of the New World to recover from his injuries. It was at this point that the bond was allowed to lapse and Critias was left to his own devices. After spending a number of centuries in a monastery in Switzerland, Critias felt the urge to travel to the New World. He arrived shortly after the Revolutionary War and became fascinated with his new country and its government that reminded him of his own ancient Athens. He slowly moved through the nascent country, settling here and there and becoming prince or staying hidden on a whim, helping to form local governments and create schools, but he was always pulled to the next center of learning. Eventually, this led him to Chicago in 1942, where he has been ever since. Critias believes he has become too wrapped up in the city's politics to leave, but in truth it was his sire's beckoning that pulled him there and bid him remain. During his time in the city, Critias has often backed anarch causes despite being one of the Primogen, believing that things will not be peaceful until all have a say in the way the kindred are governed. Despite his place as the oldest and strongest of the Primogen, Critias is one of the only members who does not realize the city is caught in a war between two Methuselah and will indeed refuse the idea that Menelaus is alive without physical evidence of it. In recent years, Critias often teaches courses at various colleges and gathers intelligent male students around him, using them to feed. Critias is incredibly sexist and shuns female students, not allowing them into his inner circle. Patricia Bolingbroke, aka Tyler. A 6th-generation Brujah embraced in the late 1300s, Patricia of Bolingbroke began life as an English peasant who turned revolutionary after her husband was murdered for poaching and her children were taken from her to become castle servants. Empowered by her grief and rage, she rose up with the likes of John Ball and Wat Tyler and became a significant figure in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Starting out as the lover of Wat Tyler, her ruthlessness and intelligence quickly brought her to prominence. Despite early success of the revolt, when backlash hit, she became a primary target and soon learned of the death of 3 of her children and the imprisonment and torture of the 4th at the hands of her oppressors. Though an obvious trap, Patricia sought to rescue her remaining child, but was recognized and caught despite her precautions. While imprisoned, a Brujah known as Robin Leland visited her and spent the entire night speaking to her of the injustices of the feudal system and possible solutions to it. By the next night, she accepted the embrace from him and began life as a vampire by taking the life of the man who destroyed her family and imprisoned her. She quickly discovered that her new vampiric existence put distinct barriers on her existence as a revolutionary leader. Prone to violent frenzies and finding people less inclined to follow her, the movement was ultimately crushed despite some concessions from the nobles, and she wound up fleeing England. Over the next 2 centuries, she traveled around Europe and wound up in Spain at the tail end of the Inquisition. Here she joined with other kindred who believed they should throw off the oppression of the elders and live openly among the mortals, and they stormed a small castle that belonged to a Ventrue elder who had a hand in the formation of the Camarilla, which was barely more than an idea at this time. The castle was destroyed, and though her companions perished, Patricia herself was able to get a hold of the battered Ventrue and drain him dry. This event sparked the Anarch Revolt and the eventual formation of the Sabbat. Chased by archons from the nascent Camarilla, Patricia fled to the New World and settled in Cartagena in South America. It was here that Helena took notice of her and began to manipulate Patricia into her service. The idea of a ruthless Brujah assassin was appealing to the Toreador and Methuselah, and over the course of 30 years managed to blood bond her. Eventually, the Camarilla began to appear in the city, forcing Patricia to flee to the English colonies, and she was eventually pulled towards Chicago by Helena's influence in the early 1900s. It was here that she took the name of her mortal lover, Tyler. Settling in the city, she believes that none know of her past as a prominent figure in the formation of the Sabbat, though some do and merely are holding that information until the time it becomes useful. Her age and strength, along with Helena's influence, have allowed her to quickly consolidate power and earn the respect of the Primogen, though during the Council Wars of the 1980s she made a mortal enemy of Critias when she slew one of his children. She also had a hand in the building of the O'Hare Airport, and controls the airport, and the kindred who wish to use its services must go through her. Joshua Tarnopolsky, aka Blackjack. Joshua is a Brujah sired by Tyler in the early 1910s. A prominent leader in the socialist movement in Chicago during its prime, Tarnopolsky was a skilled backroom politician, though he lacked the oratory skills his contemporaries claimed owing to his thick Polish accent. Tyler, who found natural sympathy with the socialist movement, wished to preserve some of its energy forever, and targeted Joshua for the embrace. She even went so far as to request permission from Woden, who granted the right due to her impressive power and in exchange for her help in his war against Modius. She chose Joshua due to his relatively unknown face despite his powerful position in the movement. He was not given a choice. After his embrace, Joshua diverted his passion into seeking change for Kindred society, as he had seen the coming demise of the Socialist Party and had quickly become disenchanted with the seniority system the Kindred employed. He quickly made contact with the Anarchs, soon being looked up to as a leader, the younger of them enthralled with his stories of prominent National Socialist figures. Joshua currently has control of most of the remaining unions within Chicago, and most of his mortal ties originate within them. It should be noted that despite Tyler being of the 6th generation due to her diablerie of the Ventrue elder in Europe, Joshua is noted as being 8th generation and not 7th. Neil Graham, aka Carl. Believing the Soviet brand of communism was the only way to save America from the Great Depression, Neil Graham sought revolution and began to recruit people in Chicago to his cause. He quickly caught the attention of the police who, at the behest of the city's industrialist leaders, determined a jailhouse suicide would be a more sure bet than hoping for a long jail sentence when dealing with the wild-eyed, bearded youth. However, Neil had also caught the eye of Joshua Tarnopolsky, who sympathized with the man, and on the night that Neil was to be killed, Joshua snuck into the police station and stopped the police from hanging him. In his rush to get the man out, Joshua broke down the wall and they fled, but Neil was shot in the back as they fled. By the time they were able to stop safely, it was clear that Neil, paralyzed from the waist down and bleeding out, would not make it, and Joshua chose to embrace him. After this, Neil continued his life's goals for many years, though he had to keep a lower profile due to being wanted by the police. Eventually, after World War II, he began to become more focused on Kindred politics and joined the Anarchs, often changing his name multiple times after various revolutionary thinkers that caught his fancy at any given time. Currently, he goes by Carl and will not answer to any other name. Hank Cave, aka Saint. A self-styled intellectual and writer, Hank ran a coffee shop and self-published his own work up until 1961 when his inheritance ran out. No publisher would touch his work, and after his coffee house was closed down, he was forced to work in a bookstore to make ends meet, causing his writing to become darker and more political. After the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, this trend only continued, and soon a publisher took notice, and his novel, The Trial of Saints, saw some minor fame. The book attracted the attention of Carl, who was drawn to the man and approached Hank in 1964, giving him the embrace. Initially, Hank loved his new existence and the thrill of drinking blood, and the ability to write in exotic and hitherto unexplorable locations. However, this feeling was ultimately fleeting and lamented never being able to see the sun again. This mood made his writing even darker and more successful still. This continued until 1968 when Loden set out to destroy the Anarchs and targeted Hank despite him never having gotten involved in vampire politics. Unfortunately, he was an unsanctioned embrace and was forced to go into hiding, protected by the Black Panthers. He hid within one of their headquarters for nearly a year until the place was ultimately raided by the police and destroyed. After this, he continued to use the basement of the destroyed building as a hideout, interfering with attempts to have it condemned and demolished, and has since opened a new coffee house within that serves as an underground meeting place for members of the intellectual scene. Since the targeting and destruction of many of his kindred friends at the hands of the prince, Hank has become galvanized into action, working to slowly and methodically destroy Loden's power in the city, and supporting Maldavis's efforts, all the while maintaining the guise of being uninterested and passive about kindred affairs. Theodore Dooley, aka Daddy D. Theodore Dooley spent much of his life living off the money extorted from the so-called soft touches, various wealthy liberals of Chicago who could be guilted into donating to charities and other causes in support of civil rights, or at least blackmailed into doing so. Though some of the funds did make it to various causes, a majority of it stayed with Theodore. One of his favorite of these people was Hank Cave, who was particularly vulnerable to the pressures of guilt. Eventually, when the Black Panthers were formed in the 60s, Dooley was radicalized and became one of their best fundraisers thanks to strong knowledge of the weaknesses of many of the city's wealthy liberals. Sometime after he joined the Panthers, in 1967, he paid Hank a visit and noticed a change in the writer. They spent a long evening in discussion and slowly learned of the transformation that the other went through. Hank became invested in the Panthers' revolution and spent the next year assisting them in exchange for Theodore finding him people to feed upon. This continued until 1968 when Loden began to hunt Hank in earnest after the Democratic National Convention riots and ensuing violence. He and Theodore met up at the Panthers' headquarters and came to a decision. Hank would use the headquarters as a new haven to hide out from the prince and his enforcers, and Hank would in turn embrace Theodore, who could take revenge on the police for what they'd done to his friends. Dooley quickly ran afoul of Horatio Ballard and Balthazar, and only the timely appearance of a group of protesters being chased by the police gave him an opportunity to escape. Since this confrontation, he has been wary of encountering the prince's men again, but still supports the Anarchs as best as he can, being one of the few who still supports Maldavis. Anita Wainwright. A warrior in the fight for civil rights, ever since her time in college in the 50s, Anita helped organize the protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention and was one of the first to be beaten by cops. After recovering from her injuries, she sought out her lover, Theodore Dooley, only to find him in the basement of the Black Panthers' headquarters feeding from a cop. Though horrified at first, this feeling quickly changed as she understood the desire for vengeance, and within a few days had convinced him to embrace her. As time passed, her involvement in human matters faded and was replaced by a fervor for change in kindred society. This passion has stayed with her over the years, and she is one of the few Anarchs in Chicago to reach out and make national connections with other Anarchs, and even some of the Sabbat in New York. As she was a major supporter of Maldavis, the city has become a bit too hot for her, and she is likely to move her operations elsewhere, with Gary being a prime consideration. Though she has little power in the city itself, her national connections give her a level of prestige many anarchs cannot claim, and can provide contact with others from all over the country, and is even able to secure passage to the west coast for those she trusts. Thomas Yule, aka Balthazar, aka Sheriff. I want to preface this entry with a note. As you may have noticed, if you have read Ashes to Ashes or watched my previous video on it, Balthazar's original name is no longer Jeremy Collins, but Thomas Yule, and that changes don't end there. His generation and his entire history have been almost completely changed from that book to this one. It is unclear why this change was made, but all material going forward uses this version of the character, effectively nullifying that original iteration. Despite these changes, his attitude and intentions, as depicted in Ashes to Ashes, seem to remain the same, and he is an unpleasant person that none but his masters wish to deal with, and is hated and derided by others of his clan. Thomas Yule was a Southern aristocrat who happened to be in New York when the Civil War began and spent time thereafter leading Confederate bandits and robbing a number of banks throughout New England, using the war as a front for making himself rich. He went as far north as New Hampshire before ultimately fleeing to Canada. It was here that his paths crossed with Alexis Blanc, a Brujah who had recently fled Europe after a failed revolution in 1848 forced her to flee to the continent to escape the Camarilla and European aristocracy. She settled in Ottawa, claiming the title of prince there. Yule spent his time in Canada attempting to recruit soldiers to the South's cause, but was mostly ignored, and he eventually found the task all but impossible after the burning of Atlanta. Alexis admired his rebellious spirit and aristocratic bearing, and in her, Yule saw a way to regain his fortune, and she saw her own failures writ large in his bearing when the South fell. Unable to resist further, she embraced him. Refusing to return to the defeated South, Thomas Yule took the name Balthazar and remained in Canada with his sire, but quickly grew tired of being beholden to her. He lived apart from her and refused to acknowledge her authority as prince, embracing a young Canadian soldier by the name of Mark. Alexis flew into a rage at this slight and took the neonate and blood-bonded him, after which the two grew very close. Eventually, the three abandoned Ottawa and traveled to Chicago in the 1870s, seeking to take advantage of the upheaval among the city's kindred. They allied with Modius in his war against Loden and began to tip the balance in the Toreador's favor. However, Balthazar, finding war was not as fun as when he was immortal, and tired of being poor and unable to continue his lavish lifestyle, ultimately betrayed Modius and his sire and turned on the Anarchs for the promise of a monetary stipend and the ability to claim his own retainers as he wished. Ballard was more than happy to acquiesce, and the Brujah led Loden's men to one of Modius's havens, where he staked his sire himself before setting the building ablaze with her in it, finding mercy only for Mark, who he let escape, a choice he would come to regret over the years. With this loyalty, Loden had time to recover from Modius's assault and gain the upper hand. Balthazar regained his lavish lifestyle and proceeded to act as an enforcer for Loden and his progeny, attempting to cover the treachery he committed with numerous smaller atrocities. Over time, he became Loden's primary enforcer and was tasked with the suppression and control of the Anarchs, who have begun to call him the Sheriff, meaning it as an insult, but he has begun to insist upon the name. As a final note, the Camarilla title of Sheriff did not seem to be a thing originally, and likely started based off of this character and was eventually rolled into the lore after the fact, though future titles may shed more light on the veracity of this claim. Mark Levesque, aka Frenchie. From a young age, Mark Levesque sought independence for Quebec, and what started as vandalism grew into more dramatic and violent acts towards the goal, such as attacking Englishmen and blowing up homes. It was through these acts of rebellion that he met Thomas Yule, and aided him on occasion in his work to help the Confederacy. Even after the end of the Civil War, when Yule became a vampire, they remained friends. One night, during an attempt to blow up a post office in 1870, his accomplice slipped and dropped the dynamite he attempted to throw. Though Mark got behind cover in time and avoided the fate of his partner, he was still grievously injured. Managing to make it back to his hideout, Balthazar found him there, and after explaining what he was, offered the embrace to him, and he quickly accepted. Shortly after his embrace, when Balthazar's sire Alexis learned of the events, she took Mark and blood-bonded him, causing him to fall deeply in love with her. Over the next several years, Mark spent much of his time terrorizing English-speaking Canadians, and when Alexis and Balthazar eventually left for Chicago, he followed. He assisted the anarch and socialist movements in the city until Balthazar turned on them, staking and burning Alexis in her haven. Since then, Mark has hated Balthazar for what he did, and would do almost anything to harm him, but does not yet have the courage to confront his sire. Though he now understands what a blood bond is, he refuses to believe his feelings for Alexis were not real, and he holds some hope that she may have escaped final death and is in torpor underneath the ruins of the building. The nickname Frenchie is something he hates, and he will fly into a rage if it is used in front of him. Damien. Much of Damien's information remains unchanged from Ashes to Ashes, but is expanded upon in places. Here we learn that his sire is, in fact, Critias, who did not remain near the boy to help him through the trauma of his change for reasons of his own that are not revealed here. We also learn a bit more of his close friendship with the kindred known as Johann, who has taught him much. Johann is not entirely sure why he helps the boy, and he is not being compelled to do so, but the two have developed a close bond. Though he often stays with the older kindred, he does maintain his own haven in an apartment downtown. He lets his adopted ward, Neon, stay there and has not yet told Johann of the boy. It is noted that more than anyone, Damien holds many secrets that could throw a wrench in the plans of the warring Methuselah in the city and would be a surprise to all, some even to himself. Travis Fett. Despite growing up in a harsh neighborhood, Travis never had much success being tough. Scrawny and bookish, he was bullied, but through this he did find a way to defend himself. He discovered he had a knack for quick wit and the ability to refocus attention off himself and redirect to another. His uncle, who worked in vaudeville, and later through many of Chicago's nightclubs, doing everything from singing and playing music, magic, and whatever else would keep him on the stage. Before long, after teaching him his talents, his uncle worked Travis into his performances, and he gained some success before even turning 13. This was not enough for Travis, though. He yearned to be feared and respected, and worked towards that goal, but it was not to be. Trying boxing, he was knocked out in his first match. In karate, he broke his hand and not the brick. Finally, he signed up for the army, and was summarily rejected for his failure to finish school. Heartbroken and with nothing left to reach for, Travis decided to end his own life and set out to walk into Lake Michigan. It was here that he was interrupted by a beautiful black woman who approached him and began to speak of his life in detail. Named Belial, she had seemingly watched him for some time and led him away from the lake and to her haven, where she embraced him. Travis greatly enjoyed the next few years of his life, marveling at the power he now had. Getting back into the nightclub scene, he started playing sax and singing, and all the while plotted revenge against any who had ever crossed him. As Maldavis rose to power, his sire became an ally of hers, and he followed suit, believing nothing could stop them with the power they had at their disposal. Being a 13th-generation kindred, this belief was quickly dissuaded when a fight broke out with Woden's men, who all proved to be much more powerful than them. In the fight, Belial was one of the last to fall, and Travis watched in horror as she was drained completely and torn to shreds. Travis fled the city, his dreams of power and control dashed, intending to never return as he began to tour the nightclub circuit. However, as the years passed, that fear turned into hate, and he re-entered the city once more, intending on having vengeance on Woden's brood, in particular the one who killed his sire. He does not know the name, but he knows he is black and wears the colors of the gang known as the Bloods. Genghis. Another familiar face, the Brujah known as Genghis, remains unchanged from his appearance in Ashes to Ashes, but we learn that his sire, named Ethrika, embraced him on a whim in the 60s as she passed through the city on her way to the west coast. It is also noted that despite his punk appearance, he has a well-kept condo for his haven, where he likes to watch Chicago Bulls games and cook for various yuppie friends he's made over the years. Despite being in the Brujah section and noted as a Brujah, the text also refers to him as Caitiff, likely as his sire left shortly after his embrace. A later genealogy chart notes that Ethrika has met her final death. The Caitiff of Chicago are not organized, generally having nothing to do with one another, and have little in common aside from all being anarchs. They share no common identity and are contemptuous of the concept of clans, feeling that they have no importance or bearing in the modern age. Gordon Keaton. Gordon was a yuppie and successful advertising executive during the 1970s that had no sympathy or empathy for those around him. His lavish lifestyle and an ad campaign that parodied the Black Panthers ultimately earned him the enmity of Theodore Dooley. Though the original plan was to drain him outright, Theodore decided instead to try and drive Gordon mad, locking him in the closet of his condo and slowly draining more blood from him each day. Theodore set out to find a loved one to further torture the man, but quickly learned that no such person existed and Gordon loved only himself. Instead, Dooley kidnapped a neighbor's child and turned Gordon, intending to subject the man to the horrible choice of his hunger or the death of a young boy. Finding he could not fight Dooley, he happily drained the child to garner some strength to face his tormentor, but was no match for the older kindred. Disgusted by his actions, Dooley threw him out of the balcony of the 24th floor condo and into Lake Michigan. Surviving the fall, Gordon made his way to a houseboat where he slaughtered the family living there and spent weeks recuperating. Since this time, Gordon has spent many years attempting to take revenge on Dooley, and even attacked a vampire he mistook for his sire, draining them dry before realizing his mistake. It was then that he learned the power to be gained from drinking an older kindred. He generally kills whenever he feeds, but takes care in destroying the body to avoid the wrath of Loden. Though he has become something of a leader of the other Anarchs, he has no real interest in their goals. Dooley maintains watch over him closely and has begun to think of him more as an ally than an enemy, which may prove to be a grave mistake as Gordon has not forgotten nor forgiven what Dooley did to him. Gordon is noted as a 10th generation, despite his sire being 11th, implying that he has committed diablerie on older kindred twice now. Priscilla Gibbs, aka Madame Zarinsky. Referred to more often as Madame, Priscilla runs a brothel for the Chicago elite, and it was through this business that she met Gordon Keaton, who became a regular of hers, and in time they became friends. Though the brothel catered to all tastes, her specialty was pain, and Gordon featured heavily in some of her premier S&M parties. She has been fascinated with the man before his embrace, and became even more so after he began to use her mansion establishment as a haven after he left the houseboat he had recovered in after his embrace, simply helping to take care of some of her competition and occasionally offering some of his blood as payment for the place to stay. Eventually, Priscilla wanted more. She went to him after a party just before dawn and begged to be turned. He refused at first, but she bit him, drinking some of his blood, and enticed him to do the same to her. He did so, but the mix of drugs in her system, plus what was already there from his earlier feeding, intoxicated him to the point that he could not stop himself. In addition, she bit into his neck and was drinking from him as he drained her. When he finally realized, he threw her off, but it was too late and she was going to die. Not wanting to lose his haven, he finished feeding her his vitae before retiring for the day. The next evening, she asked if she was now a vampire, and Gordon saw an opening to turn things further in his favor. He lied and told her that she would need to drink from him twice more over the coming nights to complete the transformation, thus securing her bond to him. Though she continues to run her brothel and escort service, Madame has started to become detached from it. Though Gordon tries to keep his control of her as subtle as possible, she knows it's there and has begun to force her into worse and worse acts. She has taken to feeding from heroin addicts to blind herself to the loss of her free will and his actions. Despite this, she has begun to become suicidal, and Gordon's control over her is the only thing preventing her from acting upon it. Though his control is near absolute, if she were to be freed from it, the connections she has developed through her work and the thrall she holds over some of the most powerful men in Chicago would easily make her one of the most powerful anarchs in the city. Richard Fulcher, aka Dickie. Richard ran away from home multiple times during his youth, and it finally managed to stick when he was 13. As the 1970s wore on and the hippies began to fade away, the punk movement filled the hole they left, and Dickie took to it quickly after meeting Valerie, a young punk from England. Through Valerie, he also learned about the powers of vampiric blood. Dickie was more than happy with his new life with her and the blood bond they shared, and spent time terrorizing straight-laced people that they treated as the antithesis of what they stood for. Valerie had plans to go even further, however. Forced to flee England after a failed anarch attempt to take over Birmingham, Valerie attempted to continue her work in Chicago. During this time, Dickie was assigned to keep an eye on the Tremere. He found a woman lying outside a nightclub in the city. This was Carol Davis, who came to be known by the name Maldavis. Valerie and Dickie nursed her back to health and taught her the ways of their kind as they knew them, and soon Maldavis began to develop amazing abilities. When Maldavis eventually began to move against the elders of the city, Valerie became one of her most devoted followers, and Dickie followed suit. When Maldavis eventually lost her bid for power, it was Valerie that paid the ultimate price. Staked and left for the sun on top of the Sears Tower, Dickie, trapped beneath the rubble of the destroyed Caitiff headquarters, felt her burn through their shared bond. Since then, he has sworn vengeance on Loden and his followers, working tirelessly to gain the power necessary to take them on. It is only recently, thanks in no small part to Dickie's gifts of obfuscate, that Loden has learned that he survived and has quickly become Loden's most sought-after target, next to Maldavis herself. Carol Davis, aka Maldavis. On a fateful night in 1980, Carol Davis went out to a jazz club with some friends and would never be the same again. While at the club, she noticed a distinguished black gentleman sitting alone at a corner table, lost in the music the club was playing. Moreover, she recognized him. This was Abraham Dusable, her great-uncle, whom she recognized only from old family photographs that included him. Having gone missing, he was believed to have been killed by the Ku Klux Klan sometime after World War I, but there he was, the same as he appeared in those photos. She sat and watched him much of the night, and once her friends finally left, she decided to approach him. Introducing herself to the man caused no reaction, but when she indicated who he was, his reaction was one of horror. He quickly insisted he would explain everything if she came with him. Though reluctant, her curiosity was too great and she agreed. A mix of desire and fear at losing what he had so carefully built for himself among the Tremere became too much, and he succumbed to a frenzy, draining her of blood outside the club. Horrified at what he had done, he fed her a drop of his blood before leaving her there and fleeing into the night. Too weak to move from the small amount of blood she was given, it was then that, as described previously, Dickie came across her as he had been spying on the Tremere and saved her from an untimely death from the eventual rising sun. As she was taught the ins and outs of being kindred and learned to harness some of her powers that others could teach her, she began to manifest some exceptional abilities which she attributed to her embrace by a Tremere, but training by a Caitiff. She kept the truth about her sire hidden, and though others knew what he was, they did not know who he was in relation to her. Due to the fact that nobody knew of a Caitiff who had been embraced by anything but a Brujah or another Caitiff, she was never able to learn any of the Tremere's unique abilities. In actuality, however, she was being watched and groomed by some of the most powerful kindred in the city to lead a war against Loden and receive blood from both the Toreador primogen Annabelle Triabel and the Brujah primogen Critias. This, in addition to their subtle nudging, made her start to loathe the way the city was run and began to gather support. She was the right voice at the right point in history to bring about change, and soon had an army of anarchs gathered at her back. As described previously, Maldavis nearly defeated Loden, and had the upper hand until the prince finally went to the primogen and promised to obey them in all things. With the loss of their support, the tides quickly shifted and many of her allies were killed. Despite this, she has continued to elude Loden, and it is believed by many that she is being kept alive by interference from the primogen in case they have need of her again. Despite the loss of their support, other elders in the city have begun to take note of her, including the mysterious Incarnu known as the Monitor. Derek Stack, aka Uriah. Derek Stack had nearly forgotten about his once-girlfriend Carol Davis, who had disappeared one night at a jazz club until she suddenly reappeared 3 years later in his apartment. She told him of what she had become and the war against the vampiric rulers of the city and her role in the conflict, and asked for his aid. The combination of her irresistible presence, and captivated by the changes he saw in her, he surrendered to the embrace and soon became one of Maldavis's most faithful supporters. He was tasked with watching Loden and keeping the anarchs informed of his movements, but eventually had a trap laid for him and he was ambushed and captured. Once subdued, they did not kill him. Instead, Loden used his powers on the man, and Derek was soon telling the prince everything he knew about the anarchs and Maldavis. With this info in hand, Loden and his men immediately moved on the anarchs and quickly destroyed their primary sanctuaries and Maldavis's personal haven, which only she and Derek knew about. Within a few nights, they were completely crushed. Since then, Loden has kept Derek under his power. Though he generally has free will, he is unable to move against the prince or tell anyone of his role in the counterattack. Despite no one knowing what he did, Maldavis no longer trusts him. A wise decision on her part, as his only goal forced on him by Loden is to locate her and inform the prince that she can finally be ended. Taking the name Uriah, he has become more boastful over time as he continues to fall out of favor with the anarchs, insisting he was instrumental in their success until Maldavis, quote, messed things up. Jimmy Halcombe, aka Neon. The entry for Neon is nearly identical to the one from Ashes to Ashes, again noting Damien as a Caitiff, and again describing the horrors he bore witness to when being embraced and left by one of Balthasar's, quote, bully boys. The only real added info is that a Malkavian known as Mom has her eyes on him. Despite the above info being unchanged, his stats tell a different story, and note that it is actually Balthasar himself who is the boy's sire. The Gangrel of Chicago are surprisingly well organized thanks mostly to their respect and deference to Inyanga, the eldest among them and Gangrel primogen of Chicago. They meet rarely, but will rally to her call if the need should arise. For the most part, they fight to push the city away from falling into anarchy, and would also quickly rise against Loden and his men if they ever got too far out of control. Their abuses are already barely tolerated by the clan. In the grand game of the Methuselah in the city, Inyanga is firmly under the sway of Menelae, and may yet use the Gangrel through her in his plots against Helena. Inyanga. Inyanga lived among the people of her tribe in southern Africa long before any European had set foot on the continent. The name Inyanga was, in fact, a title among her people that indicated both respect and fear. Like those who came before her that bore the title, she could speak with the dead and was able to tell fortunes and use herbs to heal, or kill, as needed. Her skill as a shaman became well known, and for many years she served in her role as a buffer between her people and Emagudu, the land of the dead. For the tribe who would one day come to be known as the Zulu, Emagudu was not an alternate realm where the dead dwelt, but a very real place, a dark jungle in which their dead resided. One night, however, death came to stalk her people on the wings of a bat and the paws of a wolf, and within a month 10 were dead, necks ripped open and blood drained completely. The strongest of the tribe entered Emagudu to confront this new death, but only 2 returned with fearful tales of an Esemkofu, a speechless one, who led a pack of jackals and attacked the warriors while they camped, their only recourse to leave their lands. As her people prepared to flee, Inyanga prepared to confront the evil. She entered Emagudu with her most powerful tools and herbs to face death itself. Settling down where the decaying bodies of the warriors lay, she waited, and once the moon reached its full height, the creature revealed itself. This was not what she expected an Esemkofu to be. Approaching her, the short man with a reddish tint to his skin spoke in an unknown language and laughed. As he neared, she threw crushed herbs into the air and transformed into a leopard, launching herself at the creature. They battled without pause, and though she mauled her opponent beyond recognition, the supernatural powers he displayed proved to be too much for her in the end. He hurled her against a tree, snapping her spine as she returned to her human shape. She prepared for death as he bit into her neck. Before she succumbed, however, the creature slit his own wrist and forced Inyanga to drink its own blood, and as it began to flow into her, she could feel his words in her mind, much as she once felt the voices of the animal spirits. "What are you, witch? Not one of the damnable man-beasts, else I would have known it long ago. What are you?" Before she could answer, Inyanga fell unconscious. Over the next several days, the 2 fed on the blood of the decaying warriors to restore their strength, and he explained to her what she now was, a 5th-generation Gangrel. He called himself the Egyptian, and taught her how to sleep within the earth, and in return, she told him of the secrets of Emagudu. Before long, they had little to say to one another, and he left her, returning not long after in a rage-induced frenzy about his herd, and Yanga's tribe having left. This time, she was ready for him. Taking a spear from one of the dead warriors, she thrust it through his heart, and the force of the blow combined with the force of his rush toward her carried him right to the middle of the wooden spear shaft, paralyzing him. Inyanga remained above ground, hiding under the shade of a tree as the sky lightened, slipping into the earth only as she began to see her sire begin to burn from the rays of the rising sun. Inyanga spent the next 1,000 years traveling the lands of Africa, feeding on animals until the need became too great and forced her to hunt humans as well, trying to only feed from those she considered evil, in particular those who preyed on women. She also attempted to police those of her own kind who killed indiscriminately, and found her match in 1537 when she battled a Malkavian who fed on infants. Horribly injured and chased by the Malkavian's progeny, she was forced to flee on a ship to the New World. Under the care of a faithful retainer, she slipped into torpor and spent 200 years recovering from her wounds. Eventually, she awoke in Baltimore, and the intense hunger that struck her after her long sleep resulted in a frenzy that she did not recover from until she had destroyed the descendants of her retainer, who had kept her safe all this time. Coming to her senses as the last of them died, she fled from the city and slowly made her way across the nascent United States until she eventually came to Chicago in 1852. On the outskirts of civilization at the time and far outside the influence of the ancient European kindred, she found a new home. Though now a great city and no longer on the frontier, she has no desire to return to the tragic memories of Africa. Despite this, she does still travel heavily and will often be out of Chicago as much as she is in it. She has a knack for being in the city when something important happens and away when great danger looms. Though she has lost much of her human softness in the past 1,000 years, she still considers herself a defender of mortals and is especially ruthless in defense of women. She often travels barefoot and keeps no haven, preferring to sleep in the ground of the city's parks. She greatly dislikes the premise of a European-based organization such as the Camarilla, uncomfortable with how pervasive it has become since the time of her battle in the 1500s. Despite this, she is one of Chicago's staunchest supporters of the masquerade and will go to any length to enforce it, more for the sake of the mortals than any concern for the safety of herself or other kindred. Somehow, Inyanga has managed to retain some abilities from her mortal life, which enhance some of her vampiric Auspex powers, retaining her precognition and ability to speak with the dead. In addition, she has kept the ability to transform into a leopard separate from the power given to her by the Protean discipline, though it takes an entire day to prepare for the transformation, and the herbs required are becoming incredibly rare. It should be noted that Inyanga's mortal history seems to be inspired by the works of H. Rider Haggard, a British author known primarily for his Allan Quatermain novels, who spent many years in what are now portions of the South African Republic of KwaZulu-Natal. In his book, Blackheart and Whiteheart, a character speaks of Emagudu, a forest where the Esemkofu and other spirits of the dead live. A hut stands on the edge of the forest where resides the Inyanga, who gathers wisdom from the dead, and is described as having eyes fierce and quick as those of a leopard. Doyle Fincher, aka Sledgehammer Doyle. A worker at a slaughterhouse in the late 19th century, Doyle Fincher took great care with the cattle who came through to ensure they died as painlessly as possible, striking true with his sledgehammer. For him, this was not a job but a calling. He was a high priest, and these animals were his intimate friends with whom he connected on a spiritual level at the moment of death. Inyanga first noticed him one night as he whispered to the cattle that would be killed the next day, and was moved by the sincerity and love in his voice as he did. She continued watching him over the next month and became more convinced that this was a mortal worth saving, one who still understood death and held compassion for the animal spirits. She approached Doyle and offered him life in death, and he spent the next 7 nights following her as she hunted, seeing the beauty in what she did. Making his decision, he took his sledgehammer to his own head, and Inyanga drained him of blood before providing some of her own. Doyle spent the next 100 years in exaltation of the glory of death without the need for his soulless hammer. Though he feeds primarily on animals from the cattle yard still, he will occasionally provide the ultimate experience to a human, often targeting those who are already suicidal, but believes human souls are too cluttered to truly enjoy the moment when they are joined in death. Doyle now controls what remains of the stockyards, which provides a steady supply of blood. Those too weak or too injured to hunt for themselves will come to him. He always provides what they need, for a price. That price differs from kindred to kindred, and is always some requirement of them in the form of future behavior, with no two requests alike. Some must promise to avoid certain types of mortals, or will need to feed from the lions at the zoo each week for a year, or always whispers something to the mortals they kill. Somehow he always finds out if one of these promises is broken, and whispers his own words of death to them. The seriousness with which he takes these promises is very well known among both sides of the conflict in the city. Rosa Hernandez, aka Rose. As a child, Rosa loved animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. That is, until she found out what being put to sleep meant. Though her desire to become a vet died, her love of animals never did, and by the time she was in college during the 1970s, she was a staunch animal rights activist. It was this extreme love of animals that caught the attention of Doyle Fincher, who watched her in secret as she released a number of cattle ready for slaughter and ran through the streets with them. He continued to watch her as she performed various other acts of rescuing and freeing animals, and eventually approached her in the shape of a wolf and offered her the chance to become one with the animals. She leapt at the chance. When she discovered what he truly meant by this after taking her on her first hunt, she refused to speak to him again, disgusted at his actions. She swore she would stop him and would use her abilities to only help animals, though as the years have worn on, both of these things have become less important. She still refuses to ever feed on an animal, relying only on humans for blood, often feeding from other animal rights activists who have come to trust her completely. Malcolm. Though listed, there is nothing written about this character, and it only refers you to the core rulebook for details with a couple of page numbers, which point to a character sheet and the example character creation there, denoting this as the Gangrel player character played by Lisa, who was described in that book when covering the scene from Ashes to Ashes set at the Anarch meeting in the abandoned brewery that was used as an example of play. He features in a couple other small examples in the book as well. Malcolm is a 13th generation Gangrel who had been a narcotics detective and often worked undercover. He had a fanatical drive to deal with drug pushers and other such people, and has a vendetta against the drug kingpins of the city. He was embraced by a random vagabond during one of his crusades, chasing down drug users, and has since been fired from his job due to poor attendance as he can no longer go out in the day. He wants nothing more than to carry on his life as it has been and continues in his crusade against the drug pushers of the city, still having possession of his badge, revolver, and acquiring an old police car from an auction. He only feeds on those involved in the drug trade and has developed something of a vicarious addiction due to this. The Wolf Pack. The Wolf Pack is a motorcycle gang consisting of 4 Gangrel and a ghoul who do not actually reside in Chicago, but have come to be involved in its politics more and more. Though generally they are allied with Loden, they have a huge respect for Nyanga and always listen carefully to her suggestions. Their leader is Tyrus, the 7th-generation Gangrel whom we first met in Ashes to Ashes, and remains largely unchanged from his description there, though his embrace is now noted as occurring in 1635 instead of 1662. His picture is also distinctly different from his description, which says he is quite bald. This discrepancy likely comes from the art for him being done for another book which did not contain this description. Though it again notes he's begun creating more Gangrel to make his ideal biker gang, only one member of the gang is his progeny. Next, there is Antheus, aka Dread, an 8th-generation Gangrel who began as a Greek immigrant who settled in Seattle and became a trapper. Living near a forest controlled by a Gangrel, he wound up hunting the vampire while it was in wolf form for attacking one of his animals. After a grand hunt, the Gangrel deemed him worthy of the embrace and approached him in human form. After his transformation, Antheus stayed until World War II, when he returned to Greece to help free his country from the Nazis. Afterward, he joined the Greek communists until their defeat after the Soviet refusal to aid them. Returning to America, he set off towards Washington but met Tyrus on the way and began to travel with him. Antheus is Tyrus's most trusted and respected companion, and the fondness is returned in equal measure. Another member of the gang, and a child of Tyrus, is Randy Zelly, aka Ramrod. He was a motorcycle racer during the 1950s, but he was in a terrible wreck that would have left him without the ability to walk or ride again. Tyrus, who had been watching him for some time, approached him in the hospital, unwilling to let a promising biker lose his freedom of riding. He offered him escape from his suffering, and the next night Randy took the name Ramrod and rode once more. The final kindred of the group is Jackie Goodman, aka A-Wipe. As a child, Jackie had been a huge fan of Randy Zelly before his accident and swore to be as good as his idol when he was older. In the 1960s, Jackie began to make a name for himself among the other racers when he ran into his old hero, alive, healthy, and appearing no older than he was at the time of his accident. Suspecting something supernatural, Jackie conspired to get close to the man and eventually discovered his secret. He then threatened to reveal the man's true nature unless he shared the gift with Jackie and convinced the gang to let him join. Now he and Ramrod regularly compete and show off their riding skills. Finally, there is Charles Waterstone, aka Sledge. A talented bike mechanic in the 1930s, he rejected a large family fortune to join the motorcycle racing circuit, where he first met Tyrus and the two became fast friends. Though not one of the kindred, he has been a ghoul long enough that one would have trouble telling he is not without the use of auspex. His nickname comes from the fact that any bike that does not take to his deft hands will instead experience rough treatment from a hammer. As is the case most anywhere, the Malkavians of Chicago are one of the most enigmatic of the clans. Many fear or do not understand them, though they have very little interaction with the other clans in the city. On occasion, an elder of the clan will visit the city in an attempt to organize them, but it is largely a futile effort, as the particular members in Chicago are often even more extreme and unpredictable than elsewhere. Johann is seemingly the only exception to this, and appears quite the opposite of his fellow clanmates. Maureen O'Leary. Maureen grew up in Boston in the early 1800s, and the city terrified her. The looming buildings watched her, the streets whispered things behind her back, and strangers everywhere sought to defile her soul. Her own family despised her, locking her away in an asylum built just for her. Her only respite was the thought of death, and at the age of 27 she first tried to take her own life. This proved unsuccessful, but she kept trying and seemed to finally succeed on her 15th attempt, 13 years later. She leapt from the steeple of a church, and as she hit the ground, could feel death approaching her as her life left her. The last thing she felt before the peaceful darkness met her was a sharp pain in her neck. Then she woke up to searing pain and began to scream as a cruel laugh faded into the night. She was found moments later and rushed to a hospital where doctors were mystified at the fact that she still lived, and even more so by the fact that she did not seem to have a heartbeat. As her hunger grew in her, she grabbed a nurse that leaned over her and drained her of her blood. With the feeding, she felt the strength return to her, and her paralyzed legs began to work once more, and she fled into the night. Due to a higher-than-normal need to hunt to stave off her paralysis, and an ongoing feud with her sire, the 6th-generation Malkavian known as Lasker, Maureen was forced to leave Boston and eventually settle in Chicago, where she is now one of the oldest Malkavian alive. She has begun to see herself as a matriarch for others of her clan in the city, but still retains the suicidal tendencies she had in life. With the aid of several other members of her clan, she set fire to the city in 1871 in an attempt to end herself, but ironically was the only one of those who aided her to not perish, and her haven, the infamous O'Leary Mansion, was one of the few buildings not burned down in the blaze. While most casualties due to the fire were relatively limited, it crippled the Kindred power structure in the city and allowed Loden to seize power from Maxwell. Since then, Loden often jokes about how he owes Maureen, treating her with exaggerated respect and referring to her as "my queen" in her presence. This treatment unnerves her greatly, and she attempts to avoid all contact with the prince, but he insists on her presence, sending his men to deliver her for a celebration at the Art Institute on the anniversary of the fire each year. The mortal world does little to incite Maureen's paranoia any longer, but has heightened dramatically over time when it comes to the Kindred, and she does everything in her power to keep herself and her brood out of the conflicts of the city. She would likely be better off somewhere else, but has neither the drive nor organizational skill to enact such a change, and is content enough in the city with her hunting needs able to be fulfilled. Despite her embrace occurring at the age of 40, Maureen's appearance is that of someone 20 years older, taking on the appearance of a sweet old lady, often wheelchair-bound. Jason Newberry, aka Sun. A troubled youth, Jason showed signs of psychopathy at a young age that began with torture of small insects but quickly evolved into the targeting of other children. Coming from a wealthy family, his parents managed to keep him out of jail by sending him to a mental institution where he came to the attention of Maureen O'Leary, who became fascinated with the sadistic teen and began watching him. During a visit home, Jason set fire to his parents, and this act was too much for Maureen to resist. She leapt on the boy and embraced him there next to the smoldering body of his father. His dying parents became his first feeding victims afterward. Luckily, this was near the time Loden was still wresting control of Chicago away from Maxwell, and Maureen's support in his efforts granted her the right to embrace. Due to this, Loden has his own personal nickname for Jason, Gift. In the time since his embrace, Jason has preferred to go by the name Sun, and though his cruelty is much unchanged, his methods have leaned more towards mental torment than physical. He prefers to hunt and feed from couples, luring them back to his haven and feeding from one, and convincing them they've been turned into a vampire and forcing them to feed on their partner before using Dominate to prevent them from speaking of the events. During the upheavals of the 1980s, Sun ended up draining and killing a Caitiff, which provided an enjoyment that rivaled that of feeding from his parents. Since then, the urge to do so again has been increasing steadily. Publicly, he claims to be the child of Ben and Paula Smith, with only O'Leary himself and Loden knowing the truth. Despite doing this primarily as a way to tease the pair, as they were not actually married in life, he has begun finding himself believing the lie more and more. With this comes an urge to drink their blood, as he did with his true parents. In addition, Sun has taken to blackmailing Ballard on a whim, threatening the Ventrue's business affairs if he does not comply with seemingly random and inane requests like getting his picture into a specific page of the newspaper or walking the length of Soldier Field at exactly midnight that he sends to the man. Ballard initially ignored the requests, but as doing so proved to be financially detrimental, he has begun to comply. The text notes that one should be careful when employing this character in a story, and that Sun is a truly sick individual, and the depths of his depravity have likely not yet been seen. It is also likely that he will meet his end long before that can happen. Paula Smith. Suffering from a mental illness originally known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but is more commonly referred to these days as factitious disorder imposed on another, Paula Smith sought attention and sympathy by inducing illness in her two children. As can sometimes be the case, she ultimately caused the death of her children and would have been sentenced to death herself if not for the intervention of a psychologist who instead had her institutionalized. She quickly became a mother figure in the asylum, caring for other sick patients and garnering the reputation for the care she gave them, but Maureen O'Leary saw through her actions and knew it was her who was causing many of their illnesses. After watching her for a time, she received permission from the prince to embrace the woman. Since her embrace, Paula has begun to believe that she and Ben Smith are married, her real husband died long ago, and that Jason is their son. She takes no role in the Kindred politics and is more than happy to remain in the institution where she convinces the sick that her kiss will help them. but will do anything to protect her new family. Ben Smith. Ben's delusion began as small things, a belief in UFOs, the Red Menace, and the truthfulness of politicians. But over time they began to worsen until a family member had him committed when he was in his 30s. Within the institution, he became one of O'Leary's and Paula's herd until his delusions had him convinced he himself was a vampire and managed to track O'Leary to her haven in the asylum basement where he slept next to her for the day. Upon waking, O'Leary was enamored by the man's conviction of being one of the Kindred and decided to embrace him. Since this time, Ben's delusions remained unhindered, and upon meeting Paula and learning they shared a last name, he became convinced that they were married. Paula fell to this belief as well, and it remains one of his longest-maintained delusions due to being reinforced by her. He can be convinced of almost anything, but if one of his current beliefs is contradicted or challenged, he will become even more convinced of it to the point of violence. Ben has not left the institution since his embrace, though the staff believe that he had escaped sometime in the 1960s. Despite this, he is convinced that he and Sun regularly leave the facility and do things together, something Sun plans to make a reality eventually. Evan Klein, aka Raymond Falcon, et al. First seen in the Blood at Dawn story, what we know of Evan Klein/Raymond Falcon remains largely unchanged here, though we do learn more about the circumstances of his embrace. We learn that the Malkavian fascinated with his multiple personalities was none other than Sun, who met him as Raymond Falcon, striking up a conversation after hearing him play. After feeding on him later, Sun was astonished to find that the personality of Dirk McGriff then attempted to arrest him for the attack. Sun then spent the rest of the night discovering Evan's various other personalities, becoming more and more fascinated with the man. Sun then went on to petition the prince for the right to embrace Evan. As this was the 1960s, Loden was still flushed with his victory over the Anarchs and quickly granted permission to the charming Malkavian. Since his embrace, Evan has developed numerous other personalities in addition to the 23 he had originally, and can be encountered just about anywhere in the city as any one of them, though Raymond Falcon remains the most prominent. Horace Turnbull. Horace remains wholly unchanged from his entry in Ashes to Ashes, and there is no additional information on him provided here. Johann Weltman. We first met Johann way back in the VtM preview booklet that served as the first video in this series. His character and backstory remain largely unchanged here, with only minor additions relevant to current times, where it's noted he is one of the most independent kindred in the city outside of the Incarnu. He fears his actions could be influenced by some unknown Methuselah, so will stay his hands in situations with the kindred, even when his conscience demands action. Gossip among the kindred lead many to believe that he has attained Golconda. Despite being a 7th-generation Malkavian, Johann seemingly does not suffer from any derangements his clan is known for, but is prone to losing focus on occasion and staring off into the air as though watching a movie nobody else can see. He also has a habit of being multiple steps ahead of others in most things, but easily loses sight of the present as a result. The Nosferatu of Chicago are incredibly well informed, and through use of their obfuscate power, are often hidden and observing what happens in all places of power within the city for both the kindred and kine. The most important information is delivered to Khalid, the eldest of them in the city. They are also in contact with distant elders of the clan who are equally informed about situations around the world. Unlike most clans, they trust one another and their ties run deep. Any will come to the aid of another of their clan, even without the unification of a leader. Khalid. Though many Muslim leaders are undeserving of the racial and religious stereotypes heaped upon them, Khalid al-Rashid was not one of them. His appetite for atrocity was unparalleled even among the cruel men who existed in that age during the Crusades. It was the bloodshed of those times and the dark acts he committed that drew the kindred to him, for battles always leave easy prey for those who feast on blood. Among those who were drawn to the violence were kindred who had ideological leanings to one side of the conflict or the other, and among them was the Nosferatu Alexius. Once a prelate in the Eastern Orthodox Church, he believed the only way to free the Holy Lands was to corrupt the Islamic leaders as he himself had been corrupted. Khalid was his first victim. The first to fall to Khalid's rage upon the discovery of what he had become were his own men. He soon fled into the desert and would have died there if not for a Jewish hermit saving him before the sun could claim him. Khalid spent a month in the hermit's cave, feeding on sheep and studying the Kabbalah before leaving. Transformed by the experience, he set out to make what peace he could with the world, and visited various Islamic mystic sects, where he found others of his kind who taught him of Golconda. He then spent 6 centuries wandering the world in search of it, but whenever he seemed close, his violent nature and vampiric beast would take hold and send him spiraling into a frenzy of violence and despair. Eventually, in 1871, Khalid came to Chicago in search of an Nkanu said to have shown others the path to Golconda. Though he never found them, Khalid did get pulled into the politics of the city and backed Loden in his moves against Maxwell after learning of the prince's violent nature. Despite this, Khalid's support for Loden has lessened, and it was his vote that decided the Primogens' bid to overthrow the prince in the mid-80s. More recently, Khalid has begun considering seeking Golconda somewhere more peaceful, a decision that could upset the power balance in the city, but is unlikely to leave the city in the near future. He is aware of the war between the two Methuselah in the city and is fascinated by it, believing that he is in a position to influence the outcome should the opportunity arise. He is very close with his progeny, who report all they learn in the city to him. Morality is very important to Khalid, though it does not come naturally to him. Despite his goals, he has a rage in him that is ever ready to boil over and cause him to commit atrocious acts that he later regrets. He has spent centuries desperately trying to control these emotions, but has never been able to do so. Khalid's power of obfuscation are strong enough that he can conceal objects and maintain the power when he is not present. Few beyond the Primogen, his childer, and a handful of Ancilla know his identity or position in the city. Even beyond his horrid appearance, Khalid still bears the scars inflicted by the son after he was embraced. He chooses to not heal them, keeping them as an eternal reminder of his violent nature. Elżbieta Jarowski. A Polish immigrant who arrived in America with her family in 1887, she bore an almost unnatural strength. Having trouble finding a husband, she was ultimately separated from her family in New York and traveled with other Polish immigrants to Chicago a couple of years later. There she found a job in a canning factory, though marriage was still her ultimate goal. As she continued to fail at this, she slowly grew more and more bitter. One night on her way home, she was attacked by Annabelle Triabel, who was seeking to feed. To the surprise of both her and Khalid, who had been tailing the Toreador, Elżbieta turned from victim into attacker and overpowered Annabelle, beating her senseless. Before she could call the police, Khalid revealed himself and convinced the woman to follow him to his haven. There he explained Annabelle's nature and his own to Elżbieta, and offered her a place at his side. Believing this man could be the suitor she long dreamed of, she agreed. Though it was clear that marriage was not part of the deal, Elżbieta and Khalid have remained close over the years, and she keeps him informed of all she learns in the city, and provides muscle when needed. She has remained extremely hostile to Annabelle all this time, and revels in being able to interfere with the Toreador's plans despite Khalid's attempts to keep her hostility in check. Jurgis Rutkus. A Lithuanian immigrant who arrived in Chicago at the turn of the century, Jurgis quickly found the life of an immigrant in the city was not a pleasant one. Within a few years, the backbreaking work had rendered him a shadow of what he had once been and wound up destitute and out of work, his wife dead. It was then that he encountered the unionization movement and found a new purpose in life. However, by 1910, even he could see the movement was going nowhere. With the disappearance of his mentor, Tommy Hines, he quickly became despondent and sought to end his own life. Before he could do so, Khalid appeared to him and offered him an alternative. Khalid had been watching Jurgis since Hines was embraced by Loden and offered Jurgis power and immortality to keep watch on the unions for him, an appealing arrangement for the man. With the power of obfuscate and an intimate knowledge of where the Union radicals would meet, Jurgis was able to provide Khalid with a plethora of information. In addition, being ignorant of the power that Loden held made Jurgis willing to take much greater risks than most in the city, providing his sire with more information than anyone else could. One thing Khalid did not count on, however, was the bond that Jurgen and Hines shared. After the threat Modius posed to Loden was broken, the two renewed their friendship. Despite his deep respect for Khalid and pride as a Nosferatu, his relationship with Hines could easily divide Jurgen's loyalties. Peter and Tammy Walensky. As is too often the case, what seemed like a perfectly normal middle-class family was anything but for Peter and Tammy Walensky. The drunks they had for parents would find any excuse they could to punish the pair, and their life was filled with abuse, pain, and humiliation. The only solace they were able to find was with each other, and they found that they could stand nearly anything if they remained together. One evening near the end of 1950, they were only a few minutes late getting home, but this was more than enough of an excuse for their parents. They locked Peter in a closet with the promise of punishment to come, and spent the next 2 hours beating Tammy before passing out in a drunken stupor. Tammy crawled to the closet to let her brother out, and he helped her outside before re-entering the home, emptying the contents of his parents' liquor cabinet outside their room with a trail leading to the front door, and then setting the house ablaze. As they watched the home burn, Khalid appeared to them. He had been watching the children for 5 years, fascinated and repulsed by their torment. He knew he must embrace them, both to save them and to preserve their pain, but he had been unsure until this moment. He took them back to his haven and spoke gently to them of what he offered. After a few hours of talking with them, they accepted. Afterwards, they remained with Khalid for several weeks as he taught them of their new powers, but found that they were regularly returning to their old home during their nightly hunts. In time, they returned to it and began sleeping in the basement remains of the burned-out home. Mortals have begun to avoid the lot where the house had stood, as the ghosts of Peter and Tammy's parents haunted. Over time, Tammy has begun having influence over the ghosts, and through this, some minor influence in the world of ghosts, giving them access to information about the city that others do not have. Through this, they are able to provide Khalid with important information about Helena's activities. The two alternate feeding from animals and adult humans, refusing to feed from children, and will actively try to stop any kindred they see doing so. Khalid remains very active in their lives, hoping to guide them towards a future where they can break free from the torments of their past, though he is unsure of how to guide them to this end. Nathaniel Bordruff. Nathaniel spent much of his life fighting the creatures that plagued the people of New Orleans. An evangelical and vampire hunter, he was responsible for the deaths of 5 of that city's kindred during the 1920s before eventually being trapped in a shack in the bayou by a crafty 7th-generation Nosferatu. Instead of killing him, she embraced him as a cruel joke and left him in front of his church, where he slaughtered the worshippers in a frenzy upon awakening. He set about trying to make up for his actions, continuing to hunt the kindred, but quickly discovered the ancient power of the elders and the limitations of his new form, not to mention the lack of appreciation for the work that he did now that the mortal world was closed to him. He was soon hunted and forced to flee from the city. In the time since then, his hatred for the kindred has only grown, though he has become more patient. After a run-in with Sabat in New York that ended in disaster, he ultimately fled west to Chicago in the late 1960s, where he joined Loden's forces and hunted anarchs near the end of the conflicts of that period, distinguishing himself to the prince and earning the right to create a child. After establishing himself in the city, he was approached by Khalid, who showed him the ways of the Nosferatu and the true nature of Prince Loden, and asked Nathaniel to feed him information on the prince. To this end, Nathaniel happily assists both of them, and has become good at playing them off of each other. Though they both consider him an ally, he would happily destroy them both if given the opportunity, his hatred of vampires ever present. Despite this, he is no friend to the mortals either, and is one of the most ruthless and cold-blooded of the kindred in the city. Tommy Walker, aka Elicid. Much like Malcolm, Elicid is one of the player characters featured in the core rulebook and is the POV character for the example narrative that goes through the abandoned brewery Anarch meeting in that book, which is featured as a playable scene in Ashes to Ashes. Here we get a much more in-depth look at the character. A reclusive child and even more reclusive adult, Tommy was prone to rage-filled outbursts when his seclusion was broken. Eventually losing his job and then apartment, he took to living on the streets and excelled at doing so. Nathaniel Bordruff found him one night intending only to feed on him, but something in the man's eyes decided to make the Nosferatu talk to him instead. He learned of Tommy's excellent knowledge of the city, and having been owed a favor by Loden, decided to embrace him instead, convincing the man that becoming a vampire would improve the ability to maintain his seclusion. Though Nathaniel intended to blood bond his new child and utilize him in his war against the kindred, Tommy refused to drink his blood again and fought his sire, managing to escape and hide using his superior knowledge of the city. Tommy took the name Elicid after a drunk witnessed him feeding and began to laugh, and as he approached to silence him, the man spoke, saying, "Ye are death unmade, brought unto this earth, curse unmet. Your fate rides a bat's wings. Farewell, Elicid." He has used the name ever since. Elicid wishes to maintain his seclusion, but Loden's suspicion of unaffiliated kindred and Nathaniel's hatred and hunting of him pushes him ever towards the Anarchs, though he has some trust for Khalid. A clan of degenerates, the Toreador have taken what they believe to be the best parts of Chicago and ignore the rest. They are active supporters of the art and theater scenes of the city, and are also the reason that Loden keeps the sanctity of Elysium. As nearly none know of the existence of Helena, the most powerful Toreador in the city was believed to be Maria, the sire of Annabelle. Though Annabelle served as primogen, she did not have the authority as the eldest of her clan, until Maria went missing. Some suspect Annabelle is the cause, though many find this absurd. Helena, aka Portia. The daughter of the king of Argos around 1200 BC, Helena was regarded as one of the most beautiful women alive. In time, a visitor arrived, an old, ugly man by the name of Minos, who immediately fell in love with Helena. She despised him and asked her father to throw him out, but instead he said she would wed the man, his eyes glazed and distant as he told her. Horrified, Helena fled the palace with a handmaiden and ran until they collapsed with exhaustion in a cave. Upon waking, a beautiful man stood before her. This was Prius, prince of a coastal city in Asia Minor. He convinced her to flee with him to his home where he would keep her safe from Minos. There she remained safe and happy for 10 years, but eventually Minos found them. Though she suspected Minos was something other than human when they first met, now it was confirmed as he tore through Prius and his men to get to her. He defeated the mortals easily, throwing Prius through a wall. He seized Helena and took her back to Greece. Though he had long ago decided to turn her into a vampire, Minos decided to punish Helena for her actions and chained her to the bed in her father's room, spending months draining her of just enough blood that she could not properly replenish it before ultimately taking the rest and giving her just enough blood to turn her, leaving her in the room with her aged father, knowing that when she awoke she would kill him. Her spirit broken, Minos arranged their marriage, and together they ruled Argos for a time. Though she eventually came to accept her vampiric existence, she loathed Minos and sought to destroy him. She traveled to Delphi to speak to the oracle and learned that draining his blood would not only destroy him, but make her more powerful, but she found herself unable to take her revenge due to his use of Dominate on her. That is, until 13 years later when Prius returned, launching a surprise attack at dawn and plunged a wooden spear into Minos' chest. At this, Helena took the chance provided and drained her hated sire of his blood, claiming his power as one of the 4th generation. Helena and Prius lived happily in Argos, but eventually age began to take its toll on her lover. Though she offered the embrace to him, he soundly refused, but agreed to partake of her blood to gain the immortality it offered, and they remained there happy for centuries. Eventually, they decided to leave Argos and travel the world. They ultimately came to Carthage as it was just reaching its prime, and became caught up in its vision of unity for kindred and kind. As the city drew the enmity of the ancients that ruled Rome, they fought with Carthage for a time, but eventually saw that the city would ultimately fall. They fled to Rome and provided the Ventrue there the information they would need to destroy the city. In exchange, she was given control of Pompeii, where she ruled, unsuspecting of the enemy she would now have. When Menelaus, the only survivor of Carthage, discovered Helena and learned of her betrayal, his rage knew no end. Summoning a fire spirit that got out of hand, Pompeii was destroyed, and Helena would have perished along with it if not for the intervention of Prius. The two fled to Egypt, where Helena began to plot her revenge. Thus, for the next 1300 years, Helena would move empires and destroy civilizations to destroy Menelaus, nearly succeeding on multiple occasions. He was dealt a near-fatal blow in Spain, but the sun rose before they could finish the job, and he fled to the New World. She could find no sign of him and was glad for a time, as a new danger had come to Helena from within. Mortal blood no longer sustained her, and she could only feed on other kindred. Thus she began to keep a group of progeny near for just this purpose. In time, she picked up the trail of Menelaus once more and sought to renew their battle. Through the next few centuries, their conflict saw the fall of numerous civilizations as she chased him further north through the Americas, eventually trading the Spaniards for the United States military as she moved into the nascent U.S. The chase continued until their fateful battle in the lands that would eventually become Chicago, until they put each other into torpor, where their battle still continues through proxy. Menelaus gained the upper hand as the city began to form, controlling then Prince Maxwell. Through her own machinations, Helena found Loden and manipulated the Malkavians into setting the fire that allowed him to wrest control of the city and take it for himself. Having control of the city, she set out to discover the location of Menelaus' body, but the constant conflicts incited within the city at the behest of one of the two have prevented her from doing so thus far. Now, however, the game is set to change. Helena woke from torpor late last year and is now active in the city once more. The terrible thirst of her waking forced her to seek out Maria, her remaining progeny in the city, and drain her. Taking the name Portia and using the Succubus Club as her haven, she is set to take a more direct hand in the conflict to come, but has yet to recover her true strength so soon after coming out of torpor. Despite this, she effectively has control of the entire city through her manipulations. Maria. Being an elder of the 5th generation, Maria was the most powerful Toreador in the city, so far as anyone knew. Maria lived for pleasure and refused a seat on the Primogen Council, seeing it as a hindrance to her enjoyment and leaving the task to her child, Annabelle. This all came to an end when she disappeared, the first victim of Helena's rise from torpor. Annabelle Treabelle. Annabelle was first introduced to us in the core rulebook as part of the Baptism by Fire story that acted as our introduction to some of the kindred of Gary and Chicago and the larger Forged in Steel Chronicle. Info for the character there was minimal and confined to her place in the story. Here we learn much more about her. It should also be noted that the spelling of her last name seems to have changed as well. Born in the early 1700s to a musician and a prostitute, Annabelle's life was a series of ups and downs, and as she grew, she determined to find a place as the wife of a French nobleman, but ultimately only managed to gain a reputation as a strumpet. Not long after, a Spanish noblewoman by the name of Maria arrived from the New World and took a liking to Annabelle's father, and ultimately to Annabelle herself. Appreciating the young French woman's beauty, and hoping she had some of her father's skill, Maria revealed her true nature as one of the kindred to her, and embraced Annabelle. Maria told her parents that she would take the girl on a tour of the Americas, and the two left France together, never to return. For 200 years they explored the new continent and were popular wherever they went. At the height of the Jazz Age, they came to Chicago and chose to settle there. Unbeknownst to either, Helena had dominated Maria, implanting the command to create female kindred for her to eventually feed on. Though Maria and Annabelle have not had much interaction since entering the city, the disappearance of her sire has left Annabelle very nervous. From here, Annabelle's story remains unchanged from Baptism by Fire, and how it describes her. With one exception, it is revealed that her affinity for Modius does not result from a desire to pit him and Prince Lodin against one another, though she is adept at doing so, but, in fact, she is Modius's sire. Sophia Aez. Even as a child, Sophia bore an obsessive nature that saw her throw herself completely into everything she did, something that was encouraged by her father. At the age of 5, this nature turned towards dance, and she quickly excelled, her fervor frightening even the teachers who instructed her, and by her teens was apprenticed at the Chicago Ballet. All the while the encouragement from her father continued. This all changed as soon as she turned 18. She left the ballet and her father, and became an exotic dancer. She excelled at this as well, though without the encouragement of her father at last, and became famous among those who frequented such establishments. Though the money was good, it was the power she exerted over men that made it truly worthwhile to her. In time, her notoriety reached the ears of Annabelle, and after seeing her dance, she was determined to immortalize her beauty. Though not a form of dance typically recognized by the Toreador as art, Annabelle thought Sophia might be talented enough to change that, and that she would gain standing in the clan for being the one to discover it. A whirlwind romance ensued, and soon Sophia could think of nothing but this alluring Frenchwoman who revealed what it would take to complete their relationship. Enamored as she was, Sophia bared her neck and joined the ranks of the kindred. Soon enough, Annabelle invited a number of notable members of the clan to a party at her mansion where Sophia danced for them. Though they were more than impressed with the display, the general sentiment among the gathered, which included Yilmus, the Prince of Boston, was that it was not art. From that instant, Annabelle lost all interest in Sophia, leaving the girl just shy of being fully blood-bonded. Though Sophia still craves the elder's attention, she has become frustrated with the inability to shock those around her after so long, and seeks a way to change that, especially if she can surprise Annabelle once more. Brett Stryker. Brett was good-looking and knew it. He got into bodybuilding at the age of 16 and continued on into his 20s to improve his looks even more. Despite this, he never cared much for work and quickly fell into a life of crime and spent some time in jail where his looks did him no favors. Upon getting out, he quickly found that he could make good money as an exotic dancer. Much like Sophia before him, his reputation attracted the attention of Annabelle. Initially, he was put off by her, finding something about her unnerving, but after spending an evening with her, he could think of nothing else. Soon after, Annabelle decided to embrace him without warning. Though the act was initially met with shock and horror, Brett adjusted soon enough and began to enjoy his new existence. Angered at being snubbed by her clan with Sophia, Brett was a chance for her to double down and often praises him to others for his talent as an artist. Despite this, she really only cares to use him as a bodyguard and has little interest in him otherwise. Though his attraction to her has waned over time, he is fully blood-bonded to Annabelle and will do anything she says. Having always been petty, however, if not given specific orders, he is just as likely to work against her as for her, though he has express instructions to keep her safe, so there's only so much he can do in that regard. While at Annabelle's parties, he is often sullen and glares at any who attempt to speak with him unless he can get something he wants from that person, at which point he transforms into one of the most charming people in the city. Sharon and Michael Payne. A true cautionary tale for kindred who think to embrace a loved one, Sharon and Michael were prominent figures during the jazz age of Chicago in the early 1920s, and a major part of the social scene at the time. She was known for her flower arrangements, and he was an artist of moderate talent. It was Sharon who first came to the attention of Annabelle, thanks to her fierce independence and a wild streak. Despite the couple's open relationship, Sharon began seeing Annabelle in secret. In time, Annabelle broached the subject of making her one of the kindred, and the idea enthralled her. Shortly after her own embrace, she noted the desire to bring her husband into the fold and was granted permission. For a time, everything was perfect. The couple remained a part of Chicago's ever-changing nightlife, and it seemed as though their happiness would last forever. But it was not to be. Joy turned to small disagreements over little things. Disagreements turned to shouting matches, with any choice made by the other inciting rage in response. This soon made way to apocalyptic fights that saw the near destruction of a nightclub and both of their deaths before they ultimately separated. Their feud has endured over the decades and has been going so long that most do not even realize they are married, but all know of their dislike for one another. They will readily do anything in their power to interfere with one another's pleasure and happiness, stealing potential feeding victims from one another, blowing up cars, setting fire to havens, and employing any they can convince to help in their personal war on one another. Sir Henry Johnson, aka Sir. Another character first introduced in Ashes to Ashes, Sir's bio is expanded, telling more of his pre-kindred history as the retainer of a 9th-generation Toreador known as Sandra. She took him into her service while he was a naval captain with the British Navy in order to secure passage to America in the mid-1850s. Upon arrival, she made him abandon his ship and men and set off with her across the country. However, a surprise attack by Native Americans during the daytime nearly killed both of them. Once the sun set, in desperation, she drained him completely, but was unwilling to allow him to die, and fed some of the blood back to him in order to heal his wounds and see him rise as one of the kindred. She spent the next several years teaching him of their ways before they separated, never to see each other again. The remainder of his bio, describing his current state in Chicago, remains unchanged from Ashes to Ashes. Timosius Kuzlekia, aka Nero. Born to a poor Lithuanian family, Timosius had a rare gift for music, but no way to express it until he found an old and battered fiddle at the age of 8 and taught himself to play. He soon gained notoriety for his playing alongside his frenzied demeanor and odd appearance, and by the late 1800s attracted the attention of an 8th-generation Toreador named Natasha, who became enthralled by his playing and offered him the gift of immortality so that he may perfect his art. Not long after, due in part to a famine that struck the country, Timosius left Lithuania with numerous fellow countrymen and found his way to America, reaching New York in 1890, but continued to follow his people and traveled to Chicago, where he began to make a name for himself as a musician. Before long, however, he felt the need to drop out of view of mortal society before his reputation grew too much. Since then, he continues to play for his own enjoyment and the occasional festival or wedding for others in the Lithuanian community. Often he will lock himself in a soundproof basement and play non-stop for a week before eventually emerging in a hunger frenzy. As time goes on, he is finding his passion for playing diminishing, and the revelry of the blood-soaked frenzy at the end to be more and more appealing. Some find his demeanor to be more fitting to one of the Malkavian rather than the Toreador. Kathy Glentons. Kathy's ambition from the age of 10 on was to become the world's greatest guitar player. This passion only increased as the likes of artists like Hendrix came onto the scene. By 15, nothing else mattered. Despite her passion and talent, she found it difficult to break into the scene as a female rock guitarist who refused to add lyrics to her songs, believing it would detract from the music itself. To this end, she remained a minor cult figure instead of gaining any sort of national reputation. However, she did attract the attention of Timosius, who had held a powerful disdain for rock music until he heard her play. After discovering her, he attended every show she played for 3 months before finally approaching her with the same offer given to him, an eternity to perfect her art. Upon becoming convinced of his sincerity, she agreed as readily as he had once upon a time. She continued to play, and just as she was beginning to become bored with rock, punk music began to blossom, and she flung herself into it with fervor. She has since become one of the founding members of the band Baby Chorus. Thanks in part to her talent, they have gained a reputation in Chicago. During performances, she is prone to jumping into improvised solos that leave her bandmates with nothing to do for extended periods of time. The Tremere are likely the most organized clan within the city, and they work closely together to achieve their goals. Despite this, the clan's leader in the city, Nikolai, does not have the full obedience or respect of the others, likely due to his apparent age. The Great Clan is extremely interested in events in Chicago and treats those within the city as expendable probes to keep tabs on events there. They are also aware that Nikolai is under the control of a powerful Methuselah, though they have not yet determined who. Nikolai. Working in his family's vegetable field as a boy of 5 in the early 14th century, Nikolai Antonescu felt a presence come upon him as he worked at digging up some carrots. Turning, an old bearded man stood behind him in silence. After several minutes, he simply said, "You will do," and then began to walk away, stopping only to tell him he will return when he is older and to be ready before disappearing in the blink of an eye. Terrified, Nikolai fled to his home where he tried to tell others what had happened, but found himself unable to do so. No matter what he did, his mouth would simply not open when attempting to speak of the events. He could only cry, which he did for several hours. Over the course of the next 3 years, Nikolai kept a lookout for the stranger with apprehension, as well as a little anticipation. As time went on, he found that he did not fit in with his family or other villagers, who looked at him strangely or would tease him. Finally, the strange man returned and wrapped Nikolai in a cloak like his own and led him down the road. No one in the village noticed them as they walked for several miles in silence before coming to a carriage guarded by several armed men bearing strange emblems. The men did not notice them until they were in the carriage and removed the cloaks, at which point they got into the carriage and traveled north. During the trip, which ended at the Kindred Covenant in the hills, the strange man explained to Nikolai what it was to be apprenticed to a magus, their arrival bringing him both fear and excitement. Over the next 4 years, Nikolai learned the mystic arts from Magus Stormberg and proved to have a natural aptitude for it. One night, after his master had been working on a strange new ritual all day, Nikolai heard a cry from his chambers and rushed to see what was wrong. He found the old man hunched over the body of a cat, his familiar for many years, blood running from his mouth. Before Nikolai could react, the man leapt on him and bit into his throat, unable to come to his senses until the boy had been completely drained. Unwilling to lose such a talented apprentice, Stromberg embraced the youth. Nikolai awoke upon drinking the man's blood, and the magus set out explaining what occurred. He revealed that he was a senior magi of House Tremere, and that they had discovered a way to make themselves immortal, but it required that they must live off blood. Utilizing the blood of a vampire, House Tremere worked a long time on a ritual to grant them the creature's power, but, as he claimed, none of their weaknesses. Nikolai was horrified, but also somewhat excited about what he had become. Since then, Nikolai spent centuries serving his sire and the other elders of the clan faithfully in their struggle with the other kindred. In time, he distinguished himself, and in 1869 he was given his own city. Due to the quick rate of growth in the New World, Nikolai was sent there with commands to take control of the growing city of Chicago, but to keep this control hidden from the other kindred. Nikolai succeeded in these orders, beginning to weave a web of control during Loden's struggle with Maxwell to take the city. He dominated a number of survivors of the city's Great Fire that supported Maxwell and used them to turn against the prince, leaving Loden forever in Nikolai's debt. Nikolai then took his place among the city's primogen, where he remains proficient in the games he plays. Abraham Dusable. Around World War II, Nikolai began to consider that more Tremere would be needed in Chicago, but as he wanted to prove himself to the clan's other elders and didn't want his position taken by someone of greater age, he was loath to recruit from other cities. He also found the need to find someone who at least appeared to be of greater age than himself, and began to scan the minds of the city's mortals to find a good candidate. In this way, he came across Abraham Dusable, an aging lawyer with a growing rage and discontent inside of him. Despite his abundant skill as an attorney, the time period afforded him very little as a black man, and he was prevented from attending functions or utilizing services many of his peers enjoyed. In addition, his aging form left him even more bitter about his situation. Finding him perfect for his plans, Nikolai visited the man one evening and demonstrated what he was offering, and with no need of assistance from Nikolai's powers of domination, Dusable readily agreed to his offer, and it was a quick and simple matter to fake his death in the guise of a hate crime. After some months spent with the man, Nikolai took Dusable to Vienna to be introduced to the clan's elders and received the blood bond to them. Dusable happily complied, finding what he sought at last. true power that was based solely on one's own abilities and not the color of their skin. Since this time, Dusable has excelled in his position and is known to other Tremere across the country. Though he once considered taking revenge on those who wronged him in life, Nikolai dissuaded him, and he has since come to realize how petty such matters are in comparison to the pursuit of true power. Despite this, he has a lot of dirt on numerous people high in Chicago's legal and political systems and is not afraid to use it to further his own goals. He feeds almost exclusively on animals, as it is convenient and allows him to continue his studies of thaumaturgy without interruption. He tends to follow Nikolai in most matters, but his true loyalty lies to the Tremere as a whole, and he is generally fulfilled. Though upstanding in most things, he does have one dark secret, the creation of Maldavis. Due to this one slip, he now has a constant fear that it will be discovered that he is the one who sired her. Garwood Marshall. A jazz musician of a particular talent who saw himself pushed out of better-paying gigs by the emergence of white bands onto the scene just before World War II, Garwood Marshall began to despair of ever getting the recognition he deserved when Abraham Dusable found him. Dusable was taken with the talent of the man and wound up running a jazz club near the end of the war just to give him a place to play, but as he continued to not find inroads into greater fame, his anger began to grow and Dusable approached him with an offer of immortality. Fascinated with the idea, Marshall was embraced within a week. Much to Dusable's dismay, however, Garwood had no desire to seek power like much of his clan and wanted only to perfect his skill as a musician. Garwood's anger stemmed not from the need for audiences and adulation, but from a knowledge that he had real talent. Even when brought to the elders to be bonded, he spent every night watching the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra practice or perform. However, as time passed, he began to tire of music. Jazz had grown stale, and he did not care for rock and roll, and saw no future in classical music. Then came punk, and though he was leery at first, he became swept up in the raw energy and passion of the music and began to play once more. It was not long before he met Kathy Glens and became a founding member of Baby Chorus. Due to his association with the likes of Brujah, Toreador, and Malkavian through the band, Garwood is on precarious footing with his clan and is reluctant to do anything else that may put him in bad light with them or endanger his ability to play with the band. Tracy Graves, aka Erichtho. Interest in the occult swept through the Americas in the late 1800s, and Tracy Graves was one of the many who took an interest, spurred on by the writings of Shelley, Blake, and Byron, as well as the burgeoning Theosophic movement. By the time she had finished college, she was corresponding with or visiting numerous scholars on the subject. By this time she had caught the eye of Nikolai, who had taken an interest not for her mystical leanings, but for her beauty. The daughter of a lawyer he had dominated to do some work for him, Nikolai was entranced from the moment he saw her, and began making attempts to woo her. Attempts that were met more with amusement than anything at the sight of the small boy attempting to gain her affections. Before long, Nikolai, embarrassed at his clumsy attempts, changed strategy and approached her one night as she walked home from a meeting, discussing the occult with her and eventually showing off his abilities. In the practice of theosophy, there are some who believe in masters, elevated beings who will come to Earth to aid humanity, and she believed he was one, and was quick to accept what he was offering. Thus, the truth of her transformation was met with horror, and she fled from him after the embrace and attempted to kill herself. Nikolai, hurt and filled with anger, tracked her down and fed her more of his blood to help her heal, and explained to her what her existence now entailed before using Dominate to prevent her from attempting suicide again. Unwilling to admit defeat, he soon decided to take her to Vienna to receive the blood bond from the elders, but on the way she managed to overcome the domination and jumped out of the train. This resulted in Nikolai committing a dire sin against his clan. In order to prevent her death, he fed his blood to Tracy once more, completing the blood bond with her and effectively blocking any other from doing so. Thus far, he believes this has gone unnoticed. Afterward, Nikolai kept her at the chantry, hoping she would one day come to care for him, but eventually realized that this would not come to pass. After 10 years, he finally freed her, ordering her only to keep herself alive and bring no harm to him. She fled the city almost immediately and spent the next 40 years traveling the world, attempting to come to terms with her new existence. Eventually, she returned to the city bearing the name Erichtho to distance herself from her mortal family, who was still involved in the city's politics. During her time away, she did not find understanding of what she had become, but she did learn of Golconda, and also began to work at disrupting the plans of the Tremere wherever she could manage without drawing attention to herself. In Chicago, she has done much to aid the anarchs and has become friends with Maldavis. After the Anarchs' defeat, she began to keep a low profile and has not involved herself in Kindred politics. Over time, she has learned how to control some types of spirits and has two as retainers, a ghost and a poltergeist, who help protect her haven. In addition, during her travels, she has come into contact with numerous magi and is in good standing with them. The Tremere typically do not interact with those of, quote, the old order, but she does not much care for what her clan thinks. Were she ever to be put in danger, they would be willing to come to her aid, and she does not realize just how powerful a tool this actually is. Bent on maintaining the status quo, the Ventrue in Chicago are very highly organized and tend to stand as one. Indeed, all Ventrue in the city are descended from Prince Loden himself, and they present as a united front to the other kindred even when they have their own internal squabbles and rivalries. Ensuring the Ventrue maintain power in the city is more important. Olaf Holt, aka Loden. Loden began life in Norway as Olaf Holt, eventually immigrating to the U.S. in 1830, where he grew up in Pennsylvania and was eventually accepted into West Point thanks to connections his father had made. During the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s, Holt distinguished himself in the Battle of Veracruz, where troops under his command seized key artillery positions, though some made note that he stayed safely in the rear of the assault during the attack. He ignored such mutterings, as well as complaints of him taking the Silver Eagle medal from a dead colonel, and instead focused on enjoying the beautiful city. During a nighttime stroll one evening, Holt encountered two beautiful women talking in the moonlight and introduced himself, claiming to be one of the commanders of the occupying force, and showed off the medal he had taken, seemingly impressing them. Unbeknownst to him, he had just encountered Eletria, Toreador Prince of Veracruz, and her Ventrue lover, Datura. They had been speaking of the occupation and how to deal with it, and were considering seeking out an American commander to help them. Returning to their haven with him, the prince's telepathic powers soon revealed the man's lies. Though angry, she was taken with the audacious man, but not wanting to risk her lover's jealousy, offered Datura the right to embrace him. As their conversation took place mentally, Holt had no idea what was in store for him when they struck, turning him just before dawn. For the next several nights, they taught Holt of his new existence, and he soon came to revel in the power granted him by his new existence and thorough instruction from the two elders who taught him, finding a preference for feeding on beautiful women. His stay in the city far outlasted the American occupation, and he spent a happy 22 years with the two, but eventually jealousy overtook Datura at last. At first dismissing her fears, over time she became more and more convinced that Holt would steal the prince away from her, and began to retaliate against her child, first with subtlety, and then more and more openly until it began to threaten the stability of the city. The prince was soon forced to send him away, to salvage both her rule and her centuries-old relationship, and instructed him to seek a growing city like Chicago where he could make himself prince. Taking her advice to heart, Holt traveled to Chicago, where he assumed the name Loden and introduced himself to Prince Maxwell, soon establishing himself in the city and gaining allies among the other kindred there. Though he planned to eventually move against Maxwell in 1875, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was too good an opportunity to pass up, and he enacted his scheme early, as described previously, and though Maxwell managed to flee the city, he was not heard from again, and Loden claimed the title of prince, and quickly dispatched his Ventrue allies so that those that turned on Maxwell would not turn on him. Though Loden looked forward to a long, peaceful rule that mirrored his experiences in Veracruz, fate had other plans, as the previously noted history of the city is laid bare, with constant struggles with the Anarchs and other powerful kindred in the city. The need to constantly be on his guard has made the once carefree Norwegian paranoid and suspicious of everyone. To this end, he has created numerous children to help control the city and keep things under control, though even that plan has caused problems, leaving it necessary to destroy those that prove incompetent or overly ambitious. Even those who have remained loyal and useful, he teaches only what they truly need to perform their duties, despite his own extensive abilities. Tommy Hines. Originally a blacksmith's apprentice, Tommy Hines would flee this job to join the Union Army during the Civil War. While enlisted, he encountered no end of greed and corruption, and by the end he believed that more men had been killed by the corrupt businessmen and duplicitous quartermasters than Confederate bullets. These feelings were only heightened when his only brother was killed by a faulty musket that blew up in his hands. After the war, Tommy returned to Chicago and put all of his money in real estate, seeking to do everything he could to fight corruption. By 1906, he had found a place among various organizations trying to achieve his goals, but ultimately realized the industries that were corrupting his city could not be controlled, only destroyed, becoming a prime member of the city's socialist movement. It was this move that brought him to the attention of Loden. The prince had little doubt the city would survive this particular type of rebellion, but the growing power of Modius convinced him that he must begin to exert some control over it nonetheless. To this end, he kidnapped Heinz and embraced him without warning. The pain of his change compared little to what followed. Loden had locked him in a cellar with other kidnapped members of the socialist movement, and upon waking as a kindred, Heinz slaughtered them all. Loden then dominated the man and used his knowledge to completely decimate Modius' forces, as well as begin the ruination of Gary and its steel industry. As years passed, Heinz stayed in Loden's control only by the powers of dominate, but in time Heinz's strength of will grew, and that combined with the help from the Nosferatu Jurgis Rudkus, he was eventually able to break free of his sire. He quickly joined the Anarchs and has been with them since, though he keeps a low profile. Loden refuses to have him destroyed, as if he can ever be subjected to a blood bond, his knowledge of the Anarchs would make him even more useful than he was previously, and the other Ventrue are content to leave him be, not willing to believe one of their own kind would be willing to bring about their downfall. Edgar Drummond. Edgar was one of 3 sons of a railway tycoon during the 1800s and had a love of trains, but was left out of his father's will upon his death, something Edgar didn't know until it happened, having been considered too dumb to oversee the family business. Furious, he determined to start his own railway company and overtake the one his father had started, but his father's determination had been an accurate one, and Edgar soon found himself penniless and his business in ruins. Before he could approach his brothers in supplication, 2 bankers who had initially funded Edgar's venture approached him with an offer. They would provide more than enough money to keep the company going in exchange for 51% of the company's shares and the ability to name the vice president. Soon, the company prospered and was making plenty of money, allowing Edgar to focus on what he loved, running the trains. The sudden prosperity of the company soon caught the attention of Loden, who wanted someone to take charge of the rail systems for him, with Chicago quickly becoming a major rail hub for the country. Edgar seemed ideal for his position as the head of the fastest-growing rail company in the city. When approached, Edgar was overjoyed at the idea of being in charge of every single rail line and rail car in the city, and readily accepted the embrace. Ironically, Edgar's disappearance is what finally revealed the corrupt and duplicitous nature of the company he had headed, and it was soon after shut down. Edgar reveled in his power and had key employees of the various rail companies dominated to the point he can simply issue number-coded commands via loudspeaker and see them fulfilled. Unfortunately, as time has passed, the significance of the railways has been reduced due to the increase in road and air travel. Despite this, Edgar still insists that the railroads are the backbone of Chicago's commerce, and becomes irate at those who insist that rail travel is obsolete. Horatio Ballard. The time period during and after the American Civil War paved the way for the rise of the robber barons, industrialists who made millions from the government through a variety of enterprises. Though names like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt became writ large in the histories of the U.S. during these times, Chicago itself was a bit late to the party. Nonetheless, with the city poised as the gateway to the West, it soon saw its own share of opportunists, and none was so cutthroat or ruthless as Horatio Ballard, a man whose lust for money was only exceeded by his appetite. Originally from Albany, Ballard moved to the city to join his uncle in a venture selling meat to the Union Army during the Civil War, and proved gifted at getting the government to pay top dollar for the most pitiful cuts of meat. Profits from this further expanded their influence and business ventures, always finding ways to cut corners and pocket even more, and by 1871 the two were worth millions. Then came the fire. Enjoying a customary feast, the two soon heard screams in the streets, and upon investigating, soon found that their own mansion was set ablaze. Ballard's uncle died during the Great Fire, but accounts differed as to what actually happened. Some claim they saw Ballard hit his uncle across the head with a cane, leaving him in the blaze, but such voices soon disappeared or went silent, leaving Ballard free to inherit the entirety of the enterprises he had built with his uncle. One such business was one of the largest construction companies in Chicago, and he soon gathered even more wealth as the city began to rebuild, and he soon had investments that spanned the breadth of the country. Ballard never married and seemed only interested in indulging his appetite, regularly gorging himself on 12-course meals. This lifestyle would ultimately catch up with him, and he soon suffered his first heart attack. Becoming horrified by his own mortality, Ballard was soon throwing massive amounts of money into legitimate medical research, and after a second heart attack, began seeking alternative forms of healing. Anything with even an ounce of credibility saw money thrown at it as he searched for any solution. Even so, when a strange, scruffy man came to him with what he claimed to be an immortal vampire in the form of a stone-hard corpse with a wooden stake through its chest, he had his doubts. Skeptical though he was, Ballard paid the man $5,000 for the body, which he claimed he found on a rooftop near dawn, and then spent the next month deciding what to do with it. Finally, he removed the stake from the body one night, surrounded by armed guards paid for their silence and decked out with crosses, rosaries, and garlic. The body soon animated and collapsed, begging for blood. Ballard provided a few drops to it as his guards chained the creature to a chair to be questioned with the promise of more blood for its cooperation. By the next morning, Ballard, drained of much of his blood, came out of that room with more knowledge of the Kindred and their workings than any other mortal in the city. Replacing the stake in his captive, he then began to seek out Loden, the new Prince of Chicago. Together with several armed Pinkertons, Ballard found the prince's haven and entered it during the day. That evening, Loden awoke to an immensely obese man holding a stake to his heart and surrounded by armed men. Ballard told him that his only hope for survival was to make him a vampire. Before Ballard could even react, Loden had thrown the 600-pound man against the wall as if he were nothing more than a rag doll. By the time he recovered his senses, every single one of the guards he had brought with him was dead. The vampire's suit was full of holes from numerous shotgun and revolver shots, but Loden himself was unharmed. As death strolled slowly towards Ballard, the man broke and began to sob and beg for his life, offering him anything to let him live. After several moments, he realized the vampire was no longer advancing. Loden had stopped to consider, recognizing the man and knowing that he would need assistance to control the newly claimed city. Upon embracing him, Loden instructed Ballard to execute the vampire he had staked in his basement for masquerade breach, and that in exchange for eternal life and a place of prominence in his court, Ballard would ensure that Loden had enough money and power to cover any contingency. For many years, Ballard served Loden well, and though providing him with money on a whim was sometimes difficult, as Ballard's own influence and fortune grew over time, the task became easier. It was not until the rise of Modius that Ballard first saw fear in Loden's eyes and came to realize that it was his own control over the city's business leaders that served to keep the anarchs from taking over. Soon fear of the prince turned to disdain, and he began to consider his own bid for power, but stayed his hand when he learned of the Primogen Council and their support of Loden, albeit grudgingly in many cases. This did not stop him from continuing to expand his influence, however, and he personally took on the responsibility for destroying Gary's economy after Modius fled there, shifting investments away from the city where able, and dominating business leaders into incompetence where unable. Ballard's mortal family is one of his greatest assets and few weaknesses, as he is only able to feed from the children of his mortal lineage. He has worked in the background to ensure that they have roles in all aspects of the city and state, and in some cases even national prominence, and the only payment required for this prosperity is to spend a year with Great-Uncle Ballard during their youth, where they serve as vessels. Despite his vampiric nature, Ballard never lost his love for food and continues to consume it with as great a zeal now as he did in life, to the disgust of most kindred. Long practice and an immense level of willpower allow him to keep food down for days on end where other kindred vomit after even the slightest consumption. Lawrence Ballard. Shortly after his graduation in 1921, Lawrence Ballard joined his grandfather's law firm and quickly excelled in the growing realm of stock trading, becoming a prominent legal advisor for all things related to the market. This all changed when the Great Depression hit, and though his firm was well off enough to weather the storm, his business dried up quickly. He soon pivoted to other areas of corporate law, but found clients hard to come by despite his stellar reputation. It was not long after this that Great-Uncle Ballard came to visit him. Much like everyone else in his family, he had visited the man in his youth, and the visit came with a mix of excitement and trepidation due to the inconsistent memories of his time with the man. He came only to ask for legal advice on the subject of eviction, and became impressed with Lawrence's knowledge of the law, soon visiting regularly to seek his opinion on other legal matters. 2 years passed in this manner before Ballard sought permission to embrace the man and revealed to him what he truly was. Lawrence was horrified at first, but after looking him in the eyes, suddenly came to realize what a good idea it truly was. Lawrence spent many years serving his great-uncle, turned sire, with all of the devotion he could manage, and freed from his daily concerns and job was able to study the law to even further effect purely for his own benefit and interest. Having had numerous contacts in the legal and business communities of Chicago, he has managed to maintain strong influence over the city's law firms, which is to his benefit as he must feed from the partners in the larger law firms of Chicago. In more recent years, Ballard has begun to stop dominating Lawrence as thoroughly, and he has begun to become disgusted with his existence, and even more so at the abuses of his sire on the members of their family. Though he cannot move against Ballard directly, he has begun passing information to the likes of Hines and Juggler in the hopes that the Anarchs might one day put an end to him. This duplicity has begun to make him paranoid as time goes on, and he now keeps a large pistol with him at all times. Alan Sovereign. Another self-made millionaire who achieved his riches through questionable means, but unlike Horatio Ballard, Alan Sovereign's fortune came through the banking system itself via questionable mortgages and loans offered to GIs returning from World War II. He followed this up with buying up land he knew would be needed for the city's public transportation systems via bribes to public officials, making use of funds from the bank he was president of in the 1950s. From there, he took to the stock market, ever increasing his wealth as he went with little care for those that he had to con or bribe to get there. Despite all of his insider knowledge and cunning, there was one thing he could not prepare for: the IRS. Put in jail for a year and fined over $2 million, when Sovereign was finally released, he was bitter and broken. The night he left prison, he was visited by a mysterious, obese man, none other than Horatio Ballard, who promised him revenge if he did as he was told and was given $750,000 to invest. Thanks to retaining his old contacts as well as a lack of scruples, Sovereign doubled the money within a year. Pleased with the outcome, Ballard fed some of his blood to the man and made him his retainer. Sovereign spent the next 5 years serving Ballard and helping increase his already substantial wealth, but in that time never forgot the promise of revenge. Eventually, Ballard secured permission to embrace the man and did so, making Sovereign his lieutenant. Soon after, Sovereign made a number of IRS agents disappear, and now he has a feeding preference for IRS agents and other government financial lackeys. Sovereign quickly became Ballard's primary financial advisor, proving invaluable in Loudoun's securing of the city's economy due to his tight control over Chicago's banking industry. During Maldavis's rise to power, it was Sovereign who was instrumental in breaking some of her mortal allies. During this time, he also learned of rumors that feeding from and killing an older vampire, particularly one's sire, would grant you even more power. Since then, he has taken to practicing with a sharp wooden sword to one day enact his plans to do just that to Ballard as soon as possible. Capone. During the 1920s, Al Capone had effectively assumed control over crime in Chicago and eventually the city as a whole without any vampiric influence at all. Loudoun, amused by the Italian man, merely prevented any other kindred from controlling him, though he did assume some command over the mafia itself, using them to increase his own influence in the city. When Loudoun finally grew tired of the mob's violence in the city, he exerted his influence to have the man jailed for tax evasion, allowing the city to regain some calm. Loudoun then visited Capone the night that he was released from jail and offered him eternal life in addition to his old power over the mob in exchange for loyalty to Loudoun. Capone, having lost much of his influence while he was locked away, couldn't refuse and was embraced that night. The following night, he immediately began to visit various crime lords in the city and began to exert his newly gained vampiric powers over them and forge the mob into a more united front than the city had ever seen, becoming even more secretive and influential than he had previously been, and he has come to control nearly all aspects of crime in the city, claiming power over more than just the Italian mob. Though he followed Loudoun loyally for many years, in time his greed for power began to grow, and he began to start pushing into control of legal businesses as well, bringing him into direct conflict with Horatio Ballard, who had control of the city's businesses. In the 1960s, this confrontation came to a head, and the two began a secret war on one another through sabotage and blackmail that grew to the point that the police and the mob were at war with one another in the streets of the city in proxy of the battle the two fought against one another. Soon the Primogen ordered Loudoun to put a stop to it, and he did so by claiming the police and the government for himself, creating another brood to help him manage the new acquisitions. Since then, Capone holds a level of animosity for Ballard that could see him turn to the Anarchs should they be able to help him put an end to the other kindred. Even more so if he were ever to learn who actually had him jailed. In more recent years, Capone's demeanor seems to have shifted as well. Though feared by the kindred for the reputation he gained as a mortal, lately he has begun to show restraint and has started to act with a conscience. It is rumored that the mobster now seeks Golconda, though many believe this to be a fabrication. Capone has a feeding preference for pure-blooded Italian women, something he has found to be more and more rare in recent years and has begun to fly them in from the home country. Frank Gauguin. aka Nina. Growing up in the slums of Chicago in the 1930s, Frank Gauguin learned to fight at a young age and was soon running with gangs and making a name for himself. This came to an abrupt end when he was drafted into the military during World War II, where he distinguished himself as a natural leader. After the war, he returned to Chicago and for a time tried to lead a legitimate life, but found too often that prejudice against the Irish was alive and well in the city and had trouble finding work. He began to revive the old Irish mob and soon had begun to wrest some of the Mafia's stranglehold on crime away from them and gain greater influence. Before long, he was visited by a face from the past that he knew immediately: Al Capone. Capone asked Gauguin to join him in really running the crime in the city, and he readily agreed, becoming a retainer to Capone and helped take significant control of the city's underworld. In time, however, he came to realize that he had no real power and began to set in motion a plan to destroy the Kindred controlling the city. Before this could come to fruition, he was visited by Capone once more and told that permission had been given to make him one of the Kindred. Believing this would give him the power he deserved, he quickly cancelled the plans he had been setting in motion. Since becoming one of the Kindred, Gauguin has played a strong role in suppressing the anarchs and has elevated his former gang members to positions of power in business and government. He has begun to dream about becoming prince himself, though Capone has grown suspicious of him and keeps a close eye on him, a fact that Gauguin is well aware of. Gauguin's feeding preference manifests in the ability to only feed from Italian men. Pham Hong, aka Chuck Luck. Coming from a family that faithfully served Saigon's crime lords, Pham's father sought desperately to escape such shackles and found an opportunity when South Vietnam fell in 1973. Managing to get his family out of the country, they ultimately immigrated to Chicago, where he opened a small grocery store. Pham, who promised his father he would not become involved with, quote, the old gangs, was shamed by the loss of prestige and power offered by the position his family had left. He sought to offer his services to the Italian Mafia as a way of keeping his promise. Though at first he was let in only as a joke, he quickly distinguished himself through use of skills gained growing up in the war-torn city and made himself essential to the local crime bosses. With the rise of Mal Davis, Capone was able to convince Loden to allow him another childer to help him combat the growing threat, and settled on Pham as his skills would also help him in his secret war with Ballard. At the same time, a hit was put out on Pham as he had managed to filter millions of dollars of their money into offshore accounts. Capone intervened just in time and embraced the man. He took the name Chuck Luck after the Chuluk Viet Minh forces who fought the French in the First Indochina War. He finds that Westerners, particularly Ballard, tend to underestimate him more thanks to the seemingly comical pseudonym. Since becoming Kindred, he has assumed control over illegal gambling and money laundering in the city, and controls New Chinatown with an iron fist, attempting to keep all other Kindred from the area. He has become a self-appointed protector of the area's people and maintains a low profile, finding it more effective if few knew his true nature. He has a feeding preference for Vietnam War veterans. Edward Neely. Neely is another character we first met in Ashes to Ashes. Once more, little has changed, and we merely get a larger look at his backstory. Burdened with the existential guilt of sin from a young age, Edward Neely keenly understood the pain of the oppressed, and it drove him to do everything he could to bring good to the world and find relief from the weight of the guilt that plagued him. His first job was as the assistant to a young Illinois senator who was running to become a U.S. senator. Seemingly unlikely to win, hard work, dedication, and exceedingly long hours made the impossible possible, along with bringing to light the inherent corruption of the incumbent opponent. Arriving in Washington, Neely thought he would finally find relief. The good guys had won, and he had helped make a difference. But the world did not feel better, and his sense of guilt did not change. Unable or unwilling to let others in on his secret guilt, Neely took to alcohol and eventually drugs. Morphine took the guilt away, and for a year he lived with his habit, but when not high, the guilt came back ever stronger, and he soon was high all the time and his behavior became erratic. Before long, he was removed from his position and sent back to Chicago for rehab. Despite the attempts at discretion, the news soon got out and went national. It was from this that Prince Loden learned of his plight and went to meet him, offering him an alternative. Though he did not believe Loden at first, the prince showed him around the city and convinced him of the truth. In the end, Neely never actually accepted the embrace, he was simply resigned to it. Since then, he has been loyal to Loden and a dutiful and able-bodied administrator of many of Loden's assets, and has become the leader of the prince's second batch of Childer, and is often looked to for leadership and advice. Jacob Schumter. Serving on the Chicago Board of Trade, Jacob Schumter was a man who had everything he could want, and was somehow still unhappy. To this end, those around him suffered as well, until enough was enough and his wife left him, taking their 2 daughters with her. As the abuses he had heaped on his family started to come back to haunt him, Loden made contact. Seeking a strong figure in the business world for his second brood that could rival Ballard, Loden found Schumter a strong candidate, and the man jumped at the chance. His first act as a Kindred was to track down his wife and torment her, ultimately attacking and killing her, drinking her blood. Flushed with the new power that coursed through him, he did not notice his daughters bearing witness to his evils. They attacked him, but his newfound nature allowed him to recover quickly, and he retaliated in a frenzy. Despite his ferocity, the 2 girls escaped his assault and fled. Loden forgave the trespass, too interested in establishing the man to combat his older Childer's grip on the city, but soon found it was all for naught. Schumter had no true skill with business, and all he seemed to have achieved had been handed to him via his father and father-in-law. Due to this, he was no match for Ballard and his business talents. Since then, Schumter has found his existence among the Kindred to be even more frustrating than his mortal life had been, and he has quickly fallen back into old habits. Only able to feed on female victims of physical abuse, he has gathered a number to him, including managing to track down his oldest daughter and add her to his herd, but was unable to locate the younger of the 2. Unbeknownst to him, she has become a formidable vampire hunter since meeting Detective Gregory Stevens, who had been investigating her mother's murder. Having several kills to her credit, she is working her way up to the day when she can slay her father, saving her older sister in the process. Kevin Jackson. With 2 older brothers in the gang, Kevin all but grew up among the Bloods, and once he was old enough, he joined as well. Thanks to those brothers, one of whom was now a major player in the gang in Los Angeles, Kevin quickly rose through the ranks and by 1984 was the most powerful member of the gang in the city, running much of Chicago's cocaine trade. By this time, the power of Capone's mob was waning, and the strength of the so-called black gangs the crime lord had ignored was on the rise, so Loden chose Kevin Jackson to embrace into his new brood of Childer. Appearing to Kevin one night, he laid out his plans, and with a bit of help from his dominate powers, convinced the young man to join him. Though Kevin is relatively loyal to Loden, he has deep agendas of his own and is not secretive about his nature to his gang, even having embraced one of his brothers and a couple other members who all reside out west. Kevin is quickly becoming a major power in the Bloods on a national level and uses the power to great effect, and though he sometimes feeds from his fellow gang members, he has a preference for the blood of those from rival gangs. Loden's inherent racism keeps him from trusting him entirely, a fact that has not escaped Kevin. Due in part to this, Kevin will occasionally aid the Anarchs and is quietly consolidating his power should the way ever arise to make a move against the prince. Joseph Peterson. A journalist for whom the concept of objectivity and fairness are foreign, Joseph Peterson was a veteran of the Chicago Tribune's most reactionary days, actively writing in opposition to the civil rights movement. Embraced by Loden in 1972 after a less-than-stellar career as a media consultant, he now feeds exclusively on journalists and controls the Chicago media. With a single phone call, he can completely suppress a story or push it into prominence, an ability that becomes all the more powerful as media becomes more and more important in swaying the opinions of the populace. Bobby Weatherbottom, aka the Hurricane. At the age of 8, Bobby Weatherbottom received his first computer, and though it could do very little, he was fascinated by the machine, and by the age of 16 he had grown incredibly skilled in its use. As his knowledge grew, and computers came to mean more and more to him, everything else came to mean less and less, and he began to fail school. By the age of 18, he was still in the 10th grade and ultimately dropped out, leaving home and moving into a dirty, run-down apartment where various hacking exploits saw to all of his monetary needs and he could live in his squalor doing what he loved. He soon made a name for himself among the world's hackers as the Hurricane. No copy protection or heavily protected servers, business or government, could stop him. He continued on like this until one day a beautiful woman came to him, begging for his help. Her name was Amanda Searcy, and she hailed from one of Chicago's oldest and wealthiest families. She claimed her father was being framed for embezzlement at a bank, and he was the only one who could help. Upon investigation, Bobby quickly found no way her father could have been to blame for what had happened, and that the only person who could have done it was Amanda herself. learning that she was also an officer at the bank, and her plan was to use him to discredit her father and shift blame from herself to him. Bobby had begun to fall in love with the woman and quickly chose to aid her in her subterfuge, conscience be damned. Soon she was coming to him with other problems as well, and he quickly helped her climb the ranks in the bank and stashed large sums of money in her own accounts. However, as Bobby's feelings continued to grow, Amanda became more and more uncomfortable around him, blaming the feeling on how much the hacker knew about her, and she soon stopped visiting him. This did not stop Bobby, as he used his abilities to leave her notes at the bank. Soon beginning to fear the man, she contacted a distant cousin who was known for being able to help the family with hard-to-solve problems. This cousin was, in actuality, Annabelle Treabelle, the Toreador Primogen. Annabelle began to study the young man, and in casual conversation one night at the opera, mentioned him to Loden, who immediately became interested in him. Loden desired a lieutenant who had a strong knowledge of computers, a thing he did not understand but saw were becoming a major influence in the world. Meanwhile, Bobby had come to a decision and forced himself out of his hovel to meet Amanda face to face and poured his heart out to her. Much to her own surprise, Amanda acted positively to his display of emotion, coming to realize that her discomfort around him was in fact an emotional connection she had never found with another. In Bobby, she had found a kindred spirit that she could open up to. Bobby left her condo happier than he had ever been in his life, and returned to his apartment not long before dawn, and finding none other than the Prince of Chicago waiting for him. Loden did not even take the time to explain what was to happen to the man, and embraced him before Bobby knew what was happening, afterwards dominating him to return to his haven with him. Amanda spent the next day thinking of her newly found soulmate, and made multiple attempts to contact him. Unable to reach him, she went to his apartment during her lunch break, only to find that the door was open and the room splattered with blood. She contacted Annabelle once more, who was quickly able to put together what happened. Furious, Annabelle called a meeting of the Primogen, ranting of the prince's unchecked creation of Chowder without seeking their permission. It was this meeting that turned the Primogen towards support of Maldavis for a time to teach him a lesson. When the war between Loden and Maldavis settled, and Loden came crawling back to the Primogen, one of the concessions was the reuniting of Amanda and Bobby and giving partial control of the hacker to Annabelle. Though he still numbers among one of Loden's most useful lieutenants, Bobby wants nothing more than to be free of the prince so he can live in peace with Amanda, who is aware of what he is. Willing to do anything to help Bobby, she is the only person he is able to feed from, and due to this, he often has very little blood in his system. Amanda regularly confides in Annabelle about their situation, and the Toreador will go to any lengths to protect the two. Brennan Thornhill. Growing up in Colombia in the 1960s and subjected to an emotionally abusive father and half-siblings, Brennan Thornhill's only avenue of support was his mother. By the time he was a teenager, he swore he would become powerful enough to make his father pay for his actions, as well as to right the injustices in his mother's life. This opportunity came when his father moved the family to Illinois. Thanks to his connections in South America, Brennan immediately made a splash in the drug scene, and smuggling guns, emeralds, and drugs made him a rich man in only a few years. He began to invest money throughout the state, but particularly in the Chicago area, and in 1981 he bought an old warehouse and converted it into a nightclub now known as the Succubus Club. Becoming an immediate hit, the club attracted not only mortal patrons but kindred as well, and Brennan quickly found friends among their number, readily believing in their existence. Through them, he soon learned of a great war taking place between the factions of the undead, and before long he received a visit from Loden, Prince of Chicago. Loden wanted information on those who hung out in the club, and Brennan was more than willing to provide it for the price of becoming one of the kindred himself. Loden happily agreed. Unbeknownst to either of them, this was all part of the Methuselah's great game, as Helena's resting place was deep below the club, and she had grown fond of Brennan as a de facto protector of her resting place. Despite being sired by Loden, the Anarchs have come to trust Brennan, as he's given them much leeway in the club, and he has never betrayed them to the prince. Brennan never does anything without a price, though, and any favors he does for the Anarchs are repaid in kind. Despite the power and status he has gained, his plans for vengeance never changed, and soon after his embrace he snuck into his father's home, planting drugs and other evidence. Once reported to the police, it ensured his father would spend the next 20 years in jail. He seeks to expand his influence among the kindred, and many see him as self-centered and always seeking to advance his own aims at any cost. What they don't realize is he regularly sends money to his mother and never kills those he feeds on. Lorraine. Part of a rich and influential family in the realm of Illinois politics, Lorraine Matthews had been groomed most of her life for a role in public service. This all changed when she went to college and found an interest both in self-sacrifice and hallucinogenic drugs. Intending to join the Peace Corps upon graduation, plans changed once more while at a party with a friend who was being targeted by Prince Loden. However, upon laying eyes upon the strange and very high Lorraine, he changed targets quickly, becoming interested in this strange young lady like none he had ever met before. He spent the remainder of the night walking along the shore of Lake Michigan, talking with her instead of feeding on her, and quickly found that he was falling in love. Minutes before dawn, he revealed to Lorraine what he was and asked her to join him in immortality, which she more than happily agreed to. He embraced her there and quickly retreated with her to the Matthews estate. However, once there they did not sleep, for the drugs that coursed through her veins, and now his after drinking from her, kept them up. Indeed, she convinced Loden to walk out into the sun, where they endured nearly 5 seconds of sunlight before having to retreat back into the basement of the home. At first, Loden hid Lorraine and did not reveal her existence as he embraced her without permission, not long after agreeing to seek permission from the Primogen to do so. Eventually, he received approval from enough of them that he was able to introduce her to the Kindred Society. For a time, he kept her heavily dominated until he was convinced that she truly loved him in return. Since then, he has spent every waking moment with her. She must feed on the blood of drug users, with a preference for hallucinogenics, and Loden feeds on her in turn, a matter that he keeps the utmost secret. It is noted this arrangement had a hand in the ease of Loden's abduction and Ashes to Ashes, and also notes that if Loden was not revived in that story, then Lorraine is the only one still looking for him after its events. Otherwise, he keeps her very close and she is the most valued person in his life. It is also revealed that she is, in fact, his great-great-granddaughter. This section rounds out the remaining characters of note in Chicago and features those who don't quite fit into the boundaries of clan or even kindred. Aside from creatures that don't quite classify as vampires, we also get our first look at 2 vampires who hail from the Sabbat, and get our first real glimpse at how the sect functions through them. Notably, the Sabbat vampires are given no clan, and even the spot for the name of their sire is only listed as Sabbat, or Sabbat Coven. Philippe Rigaud. At the onset of the Franco-Dutch War in 1672, Philippe belonged to a French light cavalry unit that scouted and raided the invaded lands, pillaging what they could carry and burning the rest. In time, the Dutch took extreme measures and opened their dikes and flooded the lands, killing many soldiers. As fate would have it, Philippe had actually been scouting that day and had climbed a windmill to get a good view when the event took place, and became the only survivor of his unit. Unbeknownst to most, this conflict was actually enacted as part of the war between the nascent Camarilla and the vampires of the Sabbat, and as he made his way back to France, he was attacked one night while camping by 2 crazed vampires of the Sabbat. Though he managed to empty 2 pistols into his assailants, they sank their teeth into him, and it was enough to send him to the edge of madness. He passed out, and while the 2 fed, they judged the soldier fit for their purposes. When Philippe next awoke, he found that he was surrounded by dirt and trapped beneath the earth. Now one of the undead, his mind rebelled at what was happening, and he dug himself out of the earth in a frenzy. Reaching the surface, he found someone waiting for him, who quickly knocked him unconscious once more. He was brought before a Sabbat council and told that his task for the rest of eternity would be to fight the Camarilla. Mind fragmented by what he had so recently been through, and ever the good soldier, Philippe set to the task at hand with all of his being, and he took part in numerous raids on Camarilla strongholds throughout southern France. Though he and many others like him were created as cannon fodder to be thrown at these tasks, expendable and easily replaced, Philippe's background as a soldier and crazed focus on his new goal saw him survive time and time again. In 2 instances, he was the sole survivor of an attack and thus managed to feed on the blood of an elder kindred in the process, strengthening him further. In time, the New World became a prominent battleground between the 2 factions, and Philippe continued to distinguish himself in these encounters. A current tactic employed by the Sabbat is to send multiple 2 vampire scouting parties into a city to prepare the way for invasion. When the time is right, they will rapidly embrace hundreds of mortals to act as cannon fodder as the sect moves in to take over. Philippe has proved himself to be one of the most capable urban scouts in the Black Hand and has been involved in every major Sabbat takeover in the past 2 centuries. He was one of 3 scouts to oversee the claiming of New York City and has now been sent to pave the way for claiming Chicago. In recent years, Philippe has developed a fanatical need to increase his power to the point that he can no longer be harmed and keeps himself perpetually under the use of obfuscate until an opportunity to feed from an elder vampire presents itself. The only vampire he's aware of in the city that is older than himself is Tyler, and he knows of her history as being partially responsible for the founding of the Sabbat, something that none other than perhaps Helena are aware of. He intends to use this knowledge to enlist her aid and is also doing everything in his power to destabilize the region by inciting the Anarchs against the Camarilla. Wendy Wade. The only child of a successful corporate lawyer in Baltimore, Wendy was groomed from a young age for power. Attending the finest prep schools and eventually earning her law degree from Columbia University, she quickly made a splash at a prestigious law firm in New York City during the business acquisition and merger frenzy of the late 1970s. Her only mistake was walking home alone one night from a bar just as the Sabbat were seeking recruits to further their expansion of territory in the U.S., and Wendy was the perfect target of opportunity. They grabbed her from the lobby of her apartment building and swiftly threw her into a van and drove off into the night. The next thing Wendy knew, she awoke in the dark, dirt in her mouth and nose, unable to move. Aware that something about her was different, she unknowingly awakened her new vampiric powers, and over the course of an hour, moved her way up through the earth. The Sabbat grave watchers, awaiting the new arrivals, were surprised to find that where they expected a crazed and frenzied new vampire, they instead found a calm and collected individual, as rational as any typical neonate. Taking her before the Sabbat Council, she was introduced to her new life and quickly excelled once more. Finding her a quick learner and a keen observer and tactician, Sabbat elders began to groom her for greatness, and have taken to assigning her with the sect's most valuable assets. This is how she came to be part of the first scouting party to enter Chicago, alongside Philippe Rigaud. Despite this, Wendy is still very much enamored with her own power, and finds the need to hide her perceived superiority distasteful, bringing Philippe to have concerns about her ability to keep their presence hidden until the time is right. Further, Wendy has recently learned that feeding from an elder can increase her power and is on the lookout to do just that, something that will prove easily attainable as she is of the 13th generation. The Monitor. Born nearly 2,000 years ago south of Jerusalem, Rebecca grew up a fierce opponent of the Roman occupation of Judea, surpassing even her parents and joining a militant force known as the Zealots that opposed both Romans and Jewish aristocrats who oppressed the common people. Moving to Jerusalem itself, she soon became a skilled assassin and one of the few women to earn the status of Sicarius, or Dagger Man. Eventually, she gained too much notoriety from a high-profile assassination and was forced to flee the city and return to the countryside in which she grew up. It was there that she met Elihu, a Ventrue who also hated and opposed the Jewish aristocrats. She soon became his retainer and helped him in his personal war against the oppressors. Despite their efforts, the Romans began to assert dominance over the region, and in a battle with a group of legionnaires, Elihu was pierced through the heart with a wooden-tipped javelin and then set on fire. Rebecca managed to drive the soldiers off with a group of friends, and found Elihu burnt beyond recognition, but somehow still alive. She offered her blood to him to help him begin to heal, but he was unable to stop himself and soon had drained her completely. He soon came to his senses and quickly returned some of the blood to her, turning her into one of the undead. No longer safe, they were forced to flee Palestine and spent the next 1,400 years traveling the length and breadth of the Roman Empire, feeding from the rich and falling in love with one another. Then came the Inquisition. In Barcelona, at the onset, the two quickly took to battling against the persecutors, just as they fought against the Roman Empire of the past, protecting the Jews, Muslims, and other people branded as infidels by the church and government. In time, they were approached by a representative of the newly formed Camarilla, who warned them away from fighting the Inquisition on threat of a blood hunt, and in the same breath offered them membership into the new sect. Rebecca rejected the offer immediately and would have attacked the emissary if Elihu had not stopped her. He wanted to join the group, which enraged Rebecca, who saw them as just another means of oppression, and the two had their first and last fight. He left her to travel to Cathay, but before he could leave the city, Rebecca attacked him in a rage with a group of other kindred. Though her allies died to his strength, she was able to sink her teeth into his neck and drained him of his essence, not coming to her senses until he was dead at her feet. Horrified, she fled the country and returned to her homeland. From there, Rebecca spent centuries trying to control her inherent bloodlust that she now viewed as the bane of her existence. In time, she gained some level of mastery over the beast, but Golconda eluded her. She began to wander the Middle East, visiting holy sites and speaking with enlightened minds of the time period, and eventually journeyed to the caves above Mount Ararat, where she pledged to not move until she came to terms completely with the beast. In her dreams, and amidst the madness that followed, she was approached by an ancient being who had watched her for some time. They guided her through the Suspire, and 2 months later, she crawled down from the mountain, emaciated but having fully achieved Golconda. Soon after, she learned of others like herself, elder vampires who wished to be left alone, the Iconu. She joined with them and soon learned the truth of what she had so long suspected, that the most ancient of their kind, the Antediluvians, fought a secret shadow war, the immortal Jihad, and used the rest of their kind as pawns. She then became a monitor, members of the Iconu tasked with watching over regions of the world, never interfering but reporting on potential threats to the Iconu. In time, Rebecca was sent to the newly freed English colonies in America to monitor the Kindred who had a hand in the revolution. Eventually, her attention was drawn to Chicago due to the battle between Loudon and Maxwell, and seeing the constant state of rebellion and chaos and the overabundance of Kindred present, she knew something was amiss. With such a heightened state of struggle, the city would require its own monitor, and she has stayed in the city since, unseen by most Kindred. Though the monitors are meant to remain hidden and not interfere in matters, Rebecca soon found herself unable to maintain such detachment after the rise of Maldavis, who reminded her so much of herself when she was young. She became attached, but moved to help too late to save her from failing in her fight. Maldavis's fall nearly revealed Rebecca, but she just barely managed to maintain her anonymity, secretly protecting the Anarch and hoping for her eventual return to power. She has even begun trying to lead the young rebel towards Golconda through her dreams. Should things in the city ever become truly dire, she may be able to move the Iconu Council to action. Prius. Spoken of before in the entry for Helena, Prius is the Methuselah's lover and ghoul who has been with her through the millennia. As much of his story was laid out in Helena's entry, I will not repeat the majority of it, but detail new information. When first Helena and Prius were separated by the hand of Minos, and he was nearly killed, his family took him to Egypt, where he recuperated from his wounds and built a force to find her once more. After he spent 13 years tracking them through the vampire's old haunts, he found her again at last. After the battle and the revelation of her own nature, Prius refused the same gift that was forced on her, but drank her blood to gain immortality. Unaware of the nature of the blood bond, he was soon bound to her, thinking only that their love had deepened. Helena tried to avoid forcing her will on him through the bond, and succeeded until they eventually came to Carthage, where he had wanted to stay away from the conflicts that formed there, but she wanted to take part in the plan of the Brujah to rule from the city. There he served her in hunting her enemies, and came into possession of a special sword of silver made by vampire smiths that could create wounds that a vampire could not heal with their own blood. After the winds of change blew and Helena gave up the city to the Ventrue and Malkavians, they took up residence in Pompeii for a time until Menelaus tracked them down, and all three nearly died in the ensuing battle. They battled Menelaus across Europe and Asia, nearly killing him before he fled across the ocean, where they eventually followed until the fateful battle where Chicago would one day stand, and saw the both of them put into torpor. From there, Prius hid Helena and ensured she had blood while continuing to feed on her. In time, as the city grew around them, Prius decided to stop feeding from her so she could retain more blood and began hunting Kindred for his supply. As the years passed, his bond to her faded away and he realized what had happened and vowed to never drink her blood again. Few Kindred have met Prius and survived to tell the tale, and those who know of him believe him to be one of the Iconu, as the immense length of time he spent drinking Helena's blood has made his nature unclear even through the use of auspex. He slayed many vampires on both sides of the conflicts of the 1980s and maintains a supply of blood from slain Kindred in order to retain his eternal youth and strength. He greatly fears he might lose the great power Helena's blood granted him, and has considered slaying her so that he can use her blood once more without fear of the bond. Despite this, he still loves her deeply, though he feels that she betrayed him in not telling him of the bond. Now that she has awakened, he continues to do as she bids, keeping her from realizing that their bond is gone. Gulphora. Gulphora was created on the fourth day when God made all the creatures of the land, sea, and air. Or so she claims, at least. Succubi are not to be trusted, however, as like all demons, they are great liars. Believed to be one of the only succubi left on Earth with a physical presence, she has existed at least long enough to have been written about by the Sumerians as far back as 2300 BCE, and has been noted throughout history since then in various cultures who have feared her. There is likely not a vampire in existence who has killed as many as she. Gulfora arrived in Chicago with the advent of rail travel and has resided there since, moving around the city until finally settling beneath the Museum of Science and History in Hyde Park. The Nosferatu who inhabit the sewers know that something else exists down there with them, but none have seen her, and only rumors exist of a monster that lives beneath the streets. She differs greatly from vampires and is not one of them. She does not gain sustenance from drinking blood and is immune to dominate, though has an ability much like dominate herself that works on any man, Kindred included. To the Abrahamic religions, she was created alongside the angels and fell from grace. To other traditions, she is something more akin to a malevolent force of nature. Though she despises the Kindred, at least in part because she cannot feed off of them, she tends to avoid them and does not involve herself in their affairs. Yaryan. Dreaming of one day becoming a medicine man, everything changed for the man once known as Shining Deer with the arrival of Menelay, known as the Pale Wolf, to his people. When offered the gift of eternal life, Yaryan's teacher accepted and in time passed on this gift to Shining Deer himself. He eventually came to accept this new form, and for generations he and the small group that were also embraced lived in peace. Then the white men came. At first they held their ground thanks to the leadership of Chief Blackhawk, and the strength that those who had become vampires now possessed, and they soon drove the men from their fort. But then they returned with greater numbers and immortal allies all of their own. No match for their renewed onslaught, they saw defeat after defeat, until the fateful battle in which Menelay and Helena struck each other down. They experienced incalculable loss and grievous wounds in the effort to retrieve Pale Wolf's body, and soon his tribe left the land with a vow to return one day. Shining Deer stayed behind to find a safe place for Pale Wolf to recuperate. For over a century, Shining Deer protected Pale Wolf from harm and stayed secluded from the city that slowly grew up around them. In time, others like himself found him and sought to destroy Menelay, revealing that they could become even more powerful by doing so. Horrified by this revelation, he drove these visitors away, but not before they revealed that Menelay and his ancient feud with Helena was the cause of his tribe's destruction. He moved the torpid vampire to a new location and began to meditate on what he had learned. After much thought, he decided that the visitors had been correct, and much of his tribe's problems had come from Menelay. It was then that he also learned he could not act against the vampire and was determined to abandon him instead, bitter at the harm that had been done to his people. Utilizing an ancient purification rite from which he derived the name he now uses, he was able to break the blood bond tying him to the ancient vampire and fled into the city. Yaryan now hides in the city, keeping a distance from Kindred and kind alike, through use of his immense powers of obfuscate. He maintains a link to Menelay through a retainer he keeps, who checks on the resting place that he left the Brujah periodically. Despite his feelings, if anything would threaten Menelay, he would likely still go to his old master's aid. The dizzying number of Kindred in Chicago, and the power plays that occur between them are near incomprehensible, and that's before considering the backdrop that sits behind it all in the form of the ancient jihad between Helena and Menelay. This section serves to lay out some of the connections between those kindred. I'll be brief here, as this is already getting long enough, and there is very little new information revealed. The section describes the city's kindred arranged as though like a giant spoked wheel. The two Methuselahs serve as the axle around which everything turns, and notes that the two indeed share a common interest, but notes cryptically that we shall not speak of the antediluvians in this supplement. The Primogen and other elders who appear to run the city are described as the spokes of the wheel, and the Ancilla and Neonates as the rim where all the work gets done and all the damage gets taken. One interesting thing about the section is that what is considered a coterie at this point in VtM doesn't quite match up with what people may be used to now in many cases, often featuring people that interact little, not at all, or in some cases are directly antagonistic with one another due to some tangential connection. Despite this, there are a few groups that fit what you might expect from a coterie, such as with Baby Chorus or the Wolf Pack. Overall, what is shown here bears much more resemblance to the concept of relationship maps in the 5th edition of the game, revealing how characters view or feel about one another and showing the ties that bind them together through plots, scheming, or general motivation. Angels and ministers of grace defend us. Hamlet. Act 1, Scene 4. The final chapter of this book is titled Encounters, and as that title may suggest, is full of a multitude of potential encounters with a variety of themes and a dice system to use them at random should the need arise. Due to the nature of these videos focusing on the lore, I will refrain from going into detail, but it does have a variety of interesting scenarios that are worth reading if you need inspiration for a game. With that, we reached the end of a book so jammed full of lore information that this wound up being even longer than what I had for the core rulebook. I apologize for how long it has taken to get this out, but I did warn everyone in my first video that my free time is limited and I am not a quick reader. Unfortunately, these meatier books are always going to be hard for me to do in a timely manner. Luckily, we should not run into this issue again for a little bit, as there will be a number of smaller and/or story-based entries to get through next. Overall, I found this quite a fascinating book with a ton of great info and featuring some iconic VtM characters. It's not without its issues, and as with most of these older books, is very much a product of its time, but it's easy to look past those quirks and see the value that it brings. It's also where we really start to see the seeds of what VtM would become beginning to take shape, though the outline of that eventual form is still a little blurry around the edges. With so much great material, it is not hard to see why they revisited this setting time and again throughout the years, and it should be interesting seeing the changes that come about in the city over time as we get to those points. Next time, we will continue to delve into the Chicago setting and the Forged in Steel Chronicle with another story-based title, Blood Bond. Until then, always be wary of the many plots that infuse the streets of Chicago.